Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is part 3 of the Floyd Patterson career profile. Now, before we get into the story of Floyd Patterson and the next stage of his boxing career and life, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everybody that's been supporting the Career Profiles podcast. We had a little hiatus, as I've said in previous episodes. We've now got back on the saddle, back on the horse, and we are absolutely heading home with these episodes, part 3 and part 4 of the Floyd Patterson career profile. I also want to thank everybody that's been commenting about the episodes. To those on Facebook that liked the promotional video and commented about the episode. To those that have commented on Spotify, again, thank you so much. And I've noticed that there's been a big rise in the amount of people listening on Spotify. So if you are a Spotify listener listening to this episode, or you listen to any other episodes on the network, please make sure you take a moment just to leave a comment. Whether it's just a little thanks for the episode, whether it's constructive feedback, whether it's something negative, whatever it is, please use the facility that's now available to let me know about the episode. And if you prefer any more specific fighters and trainers and managers from history to be covered, I will compile a big list of them, and I will certainly adhere to try and get as many of those out as possible. So, where we left off in part 2 was that Floyd had just become the youngest ever heavyweight champion of the world at the age of 21. He also became the Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year. He beat Archie Moore to do so, and Archie Moore gave him some fantastic praise as a result of his victory over him. Bearing in mind Archie Moore was aging at this point, but still, the old mongoose was the old mongoose. Now Floyd, as a result of this victory, the attention, well, it came to him. It came to him massively. And then it was surrounding him. It wasn't something that he actually relished. He discovered he could not step into a restaurant or stroll among the rides at Coney Island without people stopping to stare at him. He rode in a victory parade and felt awkward. For him, parades were for kings or for presidents. He retreated to the comfortable house he'd recently purchased in Rockville Centre, a well-scrubbed suburb populated by families of professional men who took the train to and from their day jobs in Manhattan, traded their Brooks Brothers suits for chinos or Bermuda shorts once they returned home, and sipped highballs as they congratulated themselves for living out the American dream. Floyd, too, could congratulate himself. His uneasiness aside, as a 21-year-old black man, he'd accomplished what the middle-aged white man living in Rockville Centre had spent decades trying to achieve. He was wealthy enough to liberate not only himself and Sandra from the ghetto, but also his parents and her parents. He was famous, respected, and he stood at the peak of the boxing world as the youngest man to ever do so. So how could he top all of this? Well, by 1957, in January, Patterson was back at training camp, this time at Greenwood Lake in New York, though his next opponent had yet to be announced. Floyd thrived psychologically and physically in a rural training camp setting, removed from the distractions of family and fans, surrounded only by trainers and sparring partners. This set him apart from other champions who dreaded the Spartan regime of camp. Floyd rationalised away any concerns he may have had about being absent from his new daughter and wife, saying that once he retired from boxing, he would have much more time on his hands to devote to them than the average breadwinner. So he was back into training. But for whom? Plenty of fighters wanted a shot at the new king of the mountain, but Cus D'Amato asserted his power as Floyd's manager, letting it be known that the IBC would have nothing to do with determining who challenged his fighter. In May, D'Amato indicated that he had received 5 offers from promoters not affiliated with the IBC, including one possibility in the United Kingdom. He chose to cut a deal with his old associate from the Eastern Parkway Arena, Emil Lentz, to promote Patterson's first defence at the Polo Grounds. D'Amato was so confident of the outcome, he announced that Floyd's second title defence would take place somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. As for whom Patterson would fight, D'Amato said he planned to start at the top of the rankings of the contenders. At this time, Tommy Hurricane Jackson stood as the number 1 contender, so he was the first choice. But in order to get the fight, Jackson had to accept Lentz as the promoter and agree to his terms. If not, Jackson would be out, and D'Amato would move on to the number 2 contender. Jackson's handlers were willing to make the deal, albeit only after a good deal of haggling, and the Polo Grounds fight was set for July 29th, 1957. Jackson was the ideal choice to be the first challenger for Floyd's title. Their closely fought encounter the previous summer had ended in a split decision, which left unfinished business for Patterson, who, up until his bout with Jackson, had been demolishing the opposition. If Patterson could win convincingly over Jackson in their rematch, it would clear up any nagging questions about whether he truly was Jackson's ring superior. Floyd looked forward to the summer matchup. In the meantime, Patterson went on a 5-city American tour fighting exhibition matches. Such tours were common for champions at the time. The matches were essentially sparring bouts, conducted in front of paying audiences to earn the champ some extra cash while keeping his boxing skills sharp and his name in the paper. But Floyd's tour also gave him an opportunity to take in what he saw around him and to reflect on what it meant for him to be a black champion in mid-20th century America. While champion from the late 1930s into the 1940s, Joe Louis had never derided racial prejudice in the United States, Patterson would break with the Louis tradition. As he made his exhibition tour, he decided that the time was right to begin speaking out. He said, "Segregation and discrimination were not anything new to me. I had lived with it all my life, and like a good many Negroes, I was powerless to do anything about them until I gained a distinctive position." There was plenty of prejudice to confront, as stops on his exhibition tour proved. In Kansas City, Floyd, Dan Florio, Buster Watson and 2 sparring partners were refused service at one downtown restaurant after another. Finally, the group stopped at a grocery store and bought cheese, crackers and milk. They then retreated to their hotel. A seething Patterson told his friends that if he hadn't been contractually committed to the exhibition that night, he would have left town. When Floyd learned that Jersey Joe Walcott was staying at the same hotel, he and Florio decided to visit the one-time champ in his room. Walcott greeted his old trainer and the new world champion enthusiastically. Patterson noticed a bottle of milk and a bag of cookies on the bedside table. It was clear that Walcott too had been unable to eat in the downtown restaurants. After other stops on the exhibition tour, Patterson and his entourage boarded a train for Fort Smith, Arkansas, where the tour would wrap up. At the time, the state was the centre of the conflict over integration. Its demagogic governor, Orval Faubus, had rebuffed the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. In just a few months, federal troops would be deployed to ensure that black students were enrolled at Little Rock's Central High School. With racial tensions already inflamed, Floyd arrived at the Fort Smith station to find an all-white reception committee waiting for him. They glared as he stepped onto the platform, then formed a semicircle to block his path. No one spoke a word, but Patterson understood their message. A short standoff ensued as Patterson glanced around for the exhibition's promoter, who, as it turned out, was nowhere to be found. A few anxious moments later, a priest appeared on the platform, waded through the crowd and introduced himself to Patterson. Samuel J. Delaney, who pastored the St. John the Baptist Catholic Church in town, offered to transport Floyd and those travelling with him into town. Floyd gladly accepted the ride, as well as Father Delaney's proposal that Floyd and company stay at the St. John the Baptist Rectory that night rather than lodge at one of Fort Smith's coloured hotels. As it turned out, Father Delaney numbered among the soldiers in the integration movement in the South. For 8 years he'd been working to persuade his white parishioners to welcome African Americans to the church. Delaney was also involved in the movement to integrate the public schools. That night, Patterson showed up at the arena for his exhibition match, again only to fulfill his contract. Not until he climbed through the ropes, tested the tautness of the canvas a couple of times, and then looked around, did he realise that he was performing before a segregated audience. Every face he saw was white. The crowd was well enough mannered, though subdued, offering up only polite applause. Once the fight began, though Patterson heard blasts of enthusiastic cheers coming from somewhere in the distant shadows of the big room, it was only after the match that he discovered where those ovations came from. A single remote section of seats where black fans were allowed to sit. In that instant, Patterson resolved that he would never again fight at a venue that was not fully integrated. While changing into his street clothes, Floyd received a surprise invitation to dinner that night at a downtown Fort Smith restaurant where he would be the guest of honour. But there was a catch. The black men travelling with him would have to enter through the back door. Infuriated, Patterson refused. The whole Patterson crew fled the arena to eat with Father Delaney at a restaurant on the outskirts of town. Floyd then spent a restless night at the rectory, impatient for the early morning train that would take him away from the South. Back in New York, Patterson sent Father Delaney a cheque for $3,000 for improvements to the St. John the Baptist building in hopes that it would help the priests' integration efforts. After his experiences in Arkansas, Patterson also became a lifetime member of the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organisation, which was then battling in the courts to systematically desegregate America. The exhibition tour behind him, Floyd ensconced himself at the Long Pond Inn in Greenwood Lake, New York, to train for his first title defence. He believed he still had to show the boxing world he was a legitimate champion, one with a real knockout punch, and Hurricane Jackson's pre-fight antics helped make Floyd want to put him down. Jackson told a reporter that the heavyweight title meant nothing to him, that the upcoming fight was just another fight. Patterson was flabbergasted. How could Jackson discount everything Floyd had worked for? Jackson also announced that he regarded Patterson as an enemy. When pressed about why that was the case, Jackson maintained that the two boxers had once made a pact never to fight each other, and that Patterson violated it when he fought Jackson a year earlier. Of course, if such a pact existed, Jackson had also violated it when he stepped into the ring to fight Floyd, but that fact didn't seem to register with the Hurricane. All this caused Floyd to fume in anticipation of the fight, but he knew that knocking out Jackson would be difficult. Jackson was the most durable fighter he'd met in the ring so far. In late July, as the fight date grew close, Gay Talese, on assignment for the New York Times, joined the group of reporters at the Long Pond Inn. Talese was different from the other sports writers Patterson had encountered. For one thing, he was very neatly attired. In the shirt and tie required 1950s, most sports writers dressed as shabbily as they could. The cigarette burns in the lapels and the egg stains on the ties worn almost as badges of honour. But Talese, who came from a family of Italian-American tailors, gave his appearance a lot of attention. His reporting style was different as well. Talese seemed to prefer overhearing conversations to scribbling down answers to interview questions. When he did conduct an interview, he liked to probe his subjects about what was going on inside their heads. He took as much time and care as possible as the deadlines allowed him to get everything just right. You know, I did try to bring the sense of a short story writer to my sports pieces, Talese explained. He found he could take chances with stories in the Times sports section that would not be allowed in other parts of the paper. He said, "There is a general acceptance of people in sports as being fair game for scrutiny, held to account in a way that people not in sports are held to account. For instance, in the 1950s, you couldn't write about, or shouldn't write about, the adulteries of a person in business or politics, but you certainly could about anyone having to do with sports. I am just showing why I could write about sports with the freedoms that I had in the 1950s. I wasn't interested in putting people down. I was trying to understand them. I never had a person that I wrote about that I couldn't call up again. In the case of Floyd Patterson, I called up 50 times, and I did 50 pieces." Talese was just 3 years older than Patterson, who was used to dealing with much older sports writers. Their youth created a bond between them, but they also connected in other ways. Talese had grown up in the island community of Ocean City, New Jersey, as the Roman Catholic son of Italian immigrants surrounded by middle-class Protestants. As a consequence, he had a sense that he was a marginal American In his words, an outsider, an alien in my native nation. He could appreciate Patterson's own feelings of being an outsider. Patterson found in Talise someone who listened carefully and did not interrupt. Talise began penning pieces about Floyd that were different from the grey lady prose type of Times, and the two forged a lifelong friendship. Neither man's career would have gone the way it did without the other. The young Times reporter filed a characteristic dispatch from the Long Pond Inn detailing how much money the camp was spending on food, including $9,000 on steaks, most of which seemed to be winding up in the belly of Floyd's brother Sherman. Some of Floyd's siblings participated in his career, most particularly his kid brother Raymond, who would become a regular member of the Patterson entourage when Floyd was at the peak of his career, and who was a Golden Gloves champion before becoming a professional boxer himself. But as for Sherman, his purpose at Long Pond, other than consuming groceries, was never quite clear to Talise. Hurricane Jackson may have been the top contender, but Patterson entered the fight as a 5-1 favourite. As the fight at the Polo Grounds played out on July 29th, Floyd proved the oddsmakers were right. Floyd knocked Jackson down in the first round. In the next round, the Hurricane stayed on his feet, but Floyd seemed to score at will. In his corner between rounds, Jackson performed a set of jumping jacks, astounding the Polo Grounds audience. Perhaps he was attempting to show that Patterson's punches weren't hurting him. Before the fifth round, Jackson stomped out a sort of war dance in his corner. But for all of Jackson's show, Floyd's punches were taking a toll. Floyd scored another knockdown, and then in the 10th round, referee Ruby Goldstein declared a TKO after the Hurricane fell for a third time. The Polo Grounds crowd jeered the decision. Perhaps they wanted more jumping jacks, and Jackson made a show of protesting the call. But it was the right decision, for Jackson was clearly out of the match by that point. Any doubts about whether Patterson was the better fighter were erased, although some fans grumbled about why Patterson had not been able to put Jackson down for the count, given how poorly the all-but defenceless Hurricane had battled. And there was bad news in terms of money. Patterson had been guaranteed $175,000, but the gate receipts fell short of expectations. D'Amato agreed to waive the guarantee in exchange for 40% of the gate. Emil Lenz handed over only $123,859 to Patterson's manager. And then there was more bad news. Within hours of the bout's finale, Jackson began urinating blood. His mother took him to a Long Island hospital, where he was admitted with what was reported as kidney contusions, the result of the many body shots he'd taken from Patterson during the fight. The doctor who examined him diagnosed him as fairly sick, but not dangerously so. He needs rest, the doctor advised Jackson to remain in the hospital for a few days. The hospital staff admitted only one set of visitors, Floyd and Sandra Patterson, who arrived with Cus D'Amato. Jackson was shocked that the Pattersons came to see him. The mercurial Hurricane shook hands with the champ and wished him luck in his upcoming fights. Patterson left knowing that the tragic man-child Jackson was likely finished as a boxer of any significance. If Cus D'Amato proved masterful in his triumphant campaign to gain control of the heavyweight championship, his management of it turned out to be a whole other matter. His announcement that he planned to have Patterson fight the best contenders one by one was admirable. To have done so would have placed his fighter in league with the great Joe Louis, who did just that in his day. If D'Amato had stuck to his guns, Patterson's next challenge would have come from Eddie Machen, who prior to Jackson's loss to Patterson had been the number 2 contender. But Cus nixed him, claiming that Machen's managers were tied to the IBC. Number 3 was Harold Carter, who was then in the army and thus unavailable. What about Willie Pastrano? He'd turned down D'Amato's overtures. Nor would it be Bob Baker, Zora Foley, Ingemar Johansson, Johnny Summerlin, Johnny Holman, or Wayne Beather, the boxers who rounded out the rest of the list of the top 10 contenders. D'Amato deemed all to be unacceptable for one reason or another, most for IBC ties. In the end, D'Amato signed Pete Rademacher. Pete Rademacher was not unknown to American boxing fans. In fact, he was something of a sports hero. Just the previous year, he had won the heavyweight gold medal at the 1956 Olympic Games in Melbourne, Australia, where he scored a first-round knockout of his Soviet opponent. The fight came during the Cold War, and like all American-Soviet Olympic battles of the time, it was a politically charged contest. After Rademacher put down the USSR's Lev Mukin, members of the Hungarian boxing team rushed the ring and carried the American champion around on their shoulders. At the time, Hungary was set to explode in revolt against the Russians, an uprising that infamously was crushed by Soviet tanks. Against the backdrop, Rademacher's victory ensured his heroic status back home in the United States. Just the same, said Newsweek's influential sports columnist John Lardner of The Challenger, it is hard to believe in Pete, even for those of us who saw him win the Olympic title last year. The balding 29-year-old was much bigger than Floyd, and he had a lengthy amateur career that went back years. A Washington State native, he tried his luck in the boxing ring as early as the 8th grade, and he continued fighting. While a student at a military academy in Tennessee, he racked up dozens of amateur victories and won a national Golden Gloves title. His Olympic championship crowned his non-professional career. He learned about Marciano's retirement, returning from Melbourne, and pumped by his victory over the Soviet champion, decided he wanted to take a shot at the pro title, implorable as winning it may have seemed at the time. He convinced two affluent friends to put up guarantee money for a matchup with Patterson after Floyd defeated Moore. The Rademacher camp then contacted D'Amato and offered a $250,000 guarantee for a fight. At first, D'Amato thought the idea was preposterous, but $250,000 was nothing to blow off. Besides, D'Amato was having trouble lining up challengers who weren't IBC affiliated. Rademacher had no ties to Jim Norris or Frankie Carbo or anyone else. At the time of the offer, Patterson had yet to defend his title against Jackson, but Rademacher's backers were ready to make the deal. So D'Amato accepted, and the match was set for Sick Stadium in Seattle, with Deacon Jack Hurley, who'd served as the model for the manager in W.C. Hines' classic boxing novel, The Professional, acting as promoter. Its announcement spawned a chorus of hoots from the boxing fraternity. Floyd stood by his manager's decision and the $250,000 guarantee that came with it. Floyd was now operating as a corporation. Floyd Patterson Enterprises took in money from his ring earnings, product endorsements and personal appearances, paid to cover Floyd's training costs and give him a salary. Expenses for the Moore and Jackson fight had left a serious dent in the corporation's earnings for the year. Floyd needed the Rademacher payday to shore up his company's profits. Viewing the contest as something of a gimmick, one step above an exhibition, and tired from the Jackson fight, Floyd Patterson did not train in earnest. The fighters battled each other on August 22nd, 1957, less than 4 weeks after the Jackson fight. Rademacher was the hometown favourite and had an enthusiastic crowd rooting for him. But the boxing contingent at ringside agreed among themselves that the fight would last no more than a round, possibly 2. As soon as Patterson had a chance to connect, they thought it would be all over for Rademacher. But in the second round, it was Rademacher who connected with a right cross, and Patterson fell to the mat. The ringside timekeeper counted off 4 seconds before Floyd rose to his feet. If Patterson had been lackadaisical about Rademacher before the knockdown, it changed his attitude now. He was now energised and angry. As the fight proceeded, Floyd knocked Rademacher down 7 times, the final one coming at 2 minutes 57 seconds in the 6th round. Referee Tommy Loughran, himself a 1930s boxing champion, waved his arms to end the fight. Floyd had another knockout to add to his record. But the lingering image from the Patterson-Rademacher bout was that stunning right cross that had put the champ on his butt. How could a first-time pro do something like that to the heavyweight champion of the world? Patterson did not fight again for a year, as D'Amato went through torturous machinations to line up a challenger who met his standards. Floyd continued to retreat to remote training camps away from his wife and daughter in Rockville Centre and away from the press. So isolated was he that some columnists began referring to him as the unknown champion. Patterson was hopeful that D'Amato could find a way to make a fight with the boxer who had the greatest connection of all to the IBC, the retired Rocky Marciano. Patterson enlisted Emil Lentz to arrange the match using $1 million guarantee to entice Rocky back into the ring. Lentz was not the only one trying to make the match. Frank Sinatra, in partnership with Irving B. Kahn, the CEO of the Teleprompter Corporation, tried as well. Teleprompter was making a fortune, not so much from the speech aid machines it sold to politicians, as from now its technology that allowed it to show lucrative closed-circuit championship fights live at movie theatres across the country. Sinatra wanted to promote the fight just for the kicks, but Marciano stood to profit handsomely from Kahn's offer, $750,000 in cash and teleprompter stock. But The Rock, he wanted no more of boxing. He remained retired. The Sinatra-Kahn offer did wind up affecting Patterson's career, though. Kahn's associate, Bill Rosenstone, promoted the next Patterson bout, a 15-round title fight against Roy Harris at Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. But it wasn't quite that simple. Nothing was ever simple when Cus D'Amato was involved. The making of the Patterson-Harris fight is representative of the maddening way that D'Amato typically did business. First, a story ran over the United Press International wire claiming that negotiations were underway to stage it at Roosevelt Raceway on Long Island once the 1958 harness season ended. The day after the story hit the papers, D'Amato, who most likely was responsible for leaking the story to UPI in the first place, told the New York Times that nothing definite was in the works. He said he was in negotiations with 5 different fighters for a possible title defence. And yes, Roy Harris, a recently ranked contender whose name was being bandied about as a possibility, was one of the 5. Next, a Texas promoter offered a guarantee of $250,000 for Patterson to fight Harris in Houston. D'Amato spurned the proposal. Then, the World Boxing Committee, which was headed by Julius Helfand, who also chaired the New York State Athletic Commission, announced it would lift its recognition of Patterson as the world heavyweight champion if he didn't defend his title against a ranked contender before September the 30th, 1958. A little more than 2 weeks later, as that deadline edged closer, the Associated Press reported that the fight would take place in Los Angeles pending final settlement of the date and approval by the California Athletic Commission. Al Wheel was listed as promoter. Wheel had been Marciano's manager and had always been tight with the IBC. Why would D'Amato agree to a fight with an IBC man like Wheel at the helm? Well, within a week, the question became moot. The California Athletic Commission denied Wheel's application for a promoter's license. So, Bill Rosenstone replaced him pending approval of his application. Coming in as a co-promoter was the Deacon, Jack Hurley, who'd staged the Radermaker fight. With all this in place, the fight was set for August 18, 1958. California matchmaker George Paranousis howled about the decision because he'd already booked heavyweight matchups between Zora Foley and Pete Radermaker and Carmen Basilio and Art Aragon to occur within weeks of the proposed Patterson-Harris bout. The championship fight would no doubt hammer ticket sales for the 2 non-title fights. But the Patterson-Harris bout was given the OK, and the fighters then began preparing. Promoters expected the fight to generate around $650,000, more than $200,000 of it to come from the closed-circuit TV. Fans could pay between $3 and $7.50 to watch the fight at a movie theatre or on the big screen at a drive-in. Tickets at the Los Angeles Wrigley Field sold for as much as $40 each, extraordinarily expensive by the 1950 standards. And so, the fight was made, the price is set, but it all took a lot of time to arrange. Patterson worked out and sparred, but that wasn't the same as actually fighting. He would enter the ring against Roy Cut-and-Shoot Harris with a year's worth of ring rust. Cut-and-Shoot, Texas, was such an out-of-the-way place and nobody actually knew for sure how to spell it. Big Henry Harris, Roy's father, became known throughout East Texas and beyond for his boxing skills, both in gloved matches of record and illegal bare-knuckled brawls. Legend around Montgomery County holds that word of his fighting prowess actually reached Joe Louis's managers, who proposed a bout. Big Henry was amenable as long as Louis travelled to Texas for the fight. Big Henry wasn't about to go north to Louis's home turf, suspicious that everything would be rigged against him. The matchup never occurred. Not surprisingly, Big Henry's sons wanted to emulate their father, and Roy proved to possess the mental toughness and physical coordination to be a very successful boxer. Roy signed on with a somewhat larger-than-life character named Lou Visucci. Visucci could talk the eyes out of a bullfrog, claimed one rival Houston manager. Visucci was a New York native then managing boxers in Houston while maintaining ties with mobsters on the East Coast. With Big Henry working his corner, Roy began defeating all the boxers Visucci could arrange for him to fight. Most of Harris's bouts occurred in Houston, far removed from the boxing establishments of New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, and Boston. At the time of the Patterson fight, the American Boxing Association had Harris ranked as the number 3 heavyweight contender, trailing only Zarafola and Eddie Machen. Harris was 22-0, with quality wins over Bob Baker, Willie Pastrano, and Willie Besmanov, and he received an award from the Ring magazine for the fighter who made the most progress during the previous year, 1957. He also regularly appeared in the magazine's listing of top 10 heavyweights for several years. Novelist Joe David Brown wrote in Sports Illustrated that Harris might well be the best heavyweight produced by the state of Texas since Jack Johnson emerged from Galveston some 50 years earlier. For Patterson, at the time, he thought his timing was actually off because of that ring inactivity, and as for Harris, well, he set up camp at Arrowhead Springs in the San Bernardino Mountains above LA. He subsisted on a high-protein diet that melted too much weight off him. At one point, he was down to 174 pounds before realising he was carbohydrate deficient. 2 weeks before the fight, he was advised to address the situation by imbibing beer. He'd gained back 20 pounds by the time of the weigh-in, but the yo-yo effect of shedding weight and then putting it back on, well, it sapped Harris of his energy. Gamblers made Harris an 8-1 underdog early on, although that changed when Texas bettors, waging with their hearts rather than their best judgment, began placing big money bets on the pride of cut and shoot. By the day of the fight, Patterson was down to 3.5-1 favourite. More than 21,600 spectators crowded into Wrigley Field, including 1,600 Marines from nearby Camp Pendleton to watch the fight, setting a California Livegate record for the time of $234,183. Theatres carrying the fight on closed circuit numbered 151, including the drive-in theatre in Corone, Texas, where scores of Harris fans were ready to blow horns, hoot, and launch soda water and moonshine bottles into the air whenever cut and shoot might seem to take an advantage. As the fight unfolded, in LA, it seemed that folks in Conroe might just have a lot to cheer about. Patterson struggled with lethargic feet, the result of too much time out of the ring. Good footwork was the key to success of any boxer, but it was especially true for Floyd. He depended on speed both as a weapon of attack and defence. He relied on his ability to slip in and out of the pocket quickly to win, but without speed, he left himself open to be hit. Good footwork was also necessary for him to effectively execute his gazelle punches without being off balance. Patterson was indeed off balance in the second round when Harris launched a right uppercut straight left combination that knocked Floyd down. "I saw punches coming, and I didn't get out of the way," Patterson said. "I thought he sort of pushed me down, but if it will settle matters, let's call it a knockdown." Well, Harris had planned to attack Floyd early, and it seemed with the knockdown that his strategy was paying off. "I noticed something about Floyd before we fought," Harris said. "You had to make him mad before he started fighting his best, so I tried to take him down early in the fight before he got worked up." Unfortunately for Harris, Floyd didn't stay down, and he was a different fighter once he was back on his feet. He began to take Harris apart round after round. By the 7th round, Harris seemed exhausted and was bleeding profusely. Floyd was enough in command of the fight that he was able to pick an opening. When one presented itself, he threw a left hook right cross combination that felled Harris. Harris was able to rise to one knee as the referee counted, and the round ended before Patterson could levy further damage. A left hook dropped Cut and Shoot to the canvas for a count of 7 in the 8th round. Just before the bell, Patterson knocked him down yet again. Patterson continued to rack up points over the next 3 rounds as a battered, hemorrhaging Harris could do little to starve off Floyd's attack. In the 12th round, Patterson sent Cut and Shoot tumbling one more time. Blood cascaded down Harris, and observers at ringside speculated amongst themselves that if the referee didn't stop the fight soon, one of Cut and Shoot's eyes might fall from the socket. Big Henry, second in his son, had seen enough. He told the referee, Mushy Callahan, that the Harris corner was throwing in the towel. Cut and Shoot pleaded to go on, but Patterson heard Big Henry tell Roy that continuing was futile. 50 years later, Harris still wished his father had not stopped the fight. He believed he could have found a way to win it. He said, "This is someone I should have beaten with ease. I think about the fight all the time. I have never stopped thinking about it." While Patterson's share of the Wrigley Field ticket sales totalled $101,000, and his payday from closed-circuit television was $210,000. Floyd Patterson Enterprises made a lot of money from the fight. But Patterson himself was not happy with his performance, believing he'd been stale and slow. Fans and sports columnists were critical of how he boxed as well, supplying new timber for the chorus of non-believers in the legitimacy of his heavyweight championship reign. Falling Floyd, as Patterson detractor Jimmy Cameron sometimes called him, had allowed yet another boxer to drop into the canvas, he said. If he had been a true champion in the tradition of Joe Louis, he would have floored Harris, the reasoning went. You should have knocked Harris out before the corner stopped it, Cannon said to Patterson afterwards. Patterson explained that he believed he could have dispatched of Harris earlier, but the sight of Cut and Shoot's hideously bloodied face caused him to back off. Compassion is a defect in a fighter, Cannon said. That Harris had gone into the fight as one of the top contenders in the heavyweight division, and it seemed to be immediately forgotten about as soon as Big Henry threw in the towel. Harris became another nobody, the hitless wonder of Cut and Shoot, as Red Smith described him. The criticism, of course, stung Floyd, and he wanted change. He thought the best plan was to start with the top contender and work his way down the rankings, in order. The first 3 would have been Eddie Machen, Zora Foley, and Willie Pastrano. Pastrano had earlier turned the Patterson camp down. He, Machen and Foley went to Europe for what they thought would be easy bouts with healthy paydays. But a remarkable 6 weeks of upsets occurred following the Patterson-Harris bout. In September 1958, Machen, Foley and Pastrano all had contractual obligations for those European fights before they could sign to meet Patterson. On September the 14th, Machen fell to Ingemar Johansson in Sweden. Just 2 weeks later, Brian London, the British heavyweight champ, knocked out Pastrano. And 2 weeks after that, Zora Foley lost a 10-round decision to England's hard-hitting Henry Cooper. Sweden's undefeated Johansson, on the strength of his record and his defeat of Machen, emerged as the highest-ranking contender. There was much about a Patterson-Johansson fight that would make it marketable. Johansson was the European champion, and that meant the radio broadcast and subsequent films of the fight would play well in Europe. In the 1950s, fight promoters continued to believe that America's primarily white boxing fan base still wanted Great White Hopes to root for. Joe Louis's and Sugar Ray Robinson's fights against white challengers always made more money than their fights against black boxers. And finally, Johansson was handsome and had a bit of the playboy's air about him. He was very promotable. Immediately after his fight with Machen, Johansson signed a promotion contract with Bill Rosensohn. In it, Rosensohn agreed that within 40 days he would secure a contract for Johansson to fight Patterson. If he were unable to do so, he would give Johansson $10,000 and the Swedish fighter would be freed of its contractual obligations. If the fight occurred and Johansson won, Rosensohn would have Johansson under contract for a return bout. And thus, the negotiations began. On November 25th, D'Amato said that he was optimistic the fight could be scheduled once he was able to clarify previous misunderstandings with Johansson's manager, Edwin Ahlqvist. Again, the negotiations were complicated, made more so by D'Amato's distrustful nature. But in January 1959, Patterson and Johansson signed the contracts for a fight in June. It was understood by both sides that Patterson would get one tune-up fight prior to his bout with Johansson. For this, D'Amato had lined up Henry Cooper. Though notorious as a bleeder, it was said that the blood would start gushing if he did no more than spit on him. Of course, Henry Cooper was a game boxer, the only fighter ever to win 3 Lonsdale belts outright. Before his fight with Foley, Cooper had agreed in principle to fight Patterson for a guarantee of $75,000 after his upset win. Cooper then raised the demand to $150,000. D'Amato would have no part of that, so he began to look elsewhere. He settled on Brian London, the rugged British fighter who had upset Willie Pastrano. Patterson would fight him on May 1st, 1959, less than 2 months before the Johansson bout. London, known as the British Bulldog, held the title of British Commonwealth Champion, though Cooper, who had beaten him twice, was clearly the superior boxer. But London's no-nonsense style won him the admiration of many British fight fans. Unfortunately for Patterson, with a tough fight against Johansson looming, the London tune-up bout provided plenty of distractions as it turned into a promotional nightmare, with no one seemingly able to agree about a site or a promoter. Finally, Indianapolis was designated the location of the match, and after several promoters had been named and dropped, Bill Rosensohn emerged as the man primarily in charge. Patterson signed the 4 sets of papers presented to him by Cus D'Amato, and everything seemed ready to go. But then, a week later, D'Amato showed up at Ishin Karadag's New Jersey facility where Patterson was in training camp. Instead of going into the gym, however, D'Amato sent an emissary to fetch Floyd and bring him into his car. When Patterson climbed into the back seat, a distressed D'Amato informed him that there was trouble with the deal. Patterson would be receiving less for the London fight than D'Amato had thought, and his take in subsequent fights would be less as well. D'Amato confessed that it was all his fault. With the confusion surrounding the fight's promotion, he claimed he had failed to read the contracts carefully and had signed away some of Patterson's future earnings. But now that the ink was dry, fighter and manager had no choice but to accept them as written. Another thing Patterson learned was that there was no television revenue guarantee for the bout. Finally, D'Amato told Floyd he feared there would not be sufficient time for an effective publicity campaign in Indianapolis, which meant that the Indianapolis gate receipts might be less than anticipated. Stunned, Patterson climbed out of the car and trudged back to the gym as D'Amato drove away. Cus D'Amato promptly went underground, and Patterson publicly acknowledged that his manager had made some mistakes that would affect Floyd Patterson Enterprises, though no dollar amounts were ever disclosed. Floyd said he was still committed to D'Amato even while beginning to wonder, himself, about his manager's acumen. Or maybe that something else was going on with D'Amato. Everything seemed odd about the developing title fight. Just 2 weeks before the contest, London, typically a publicity seeker, was still hidden away in New York. Normally, a boxer would have been in the city of the fight by this time. He was registered under an assumed name at a hotel. Why was that? No one would ever say, but the mystery surrounding London seemed to bear D'Amato's stamp, especially after London, his father, his brother, and his local boxing manager were spotted leaving the East Side's Gramercy gym. When word spread that Patterson's foe was training at his home gym, working out with Patterson's regular sparring partners, and no one outside the D'Amato clique was being allowed up the stairs, observers wondered if Floyd's manager had taken charge of his challenger as well. It all seemed a bit weird, as did D'Amato's complete absence from the scene. Only later did it become clear that D'Amato did indeed have a role in London's New York management, but the details were not disclosed. Floyd remained silent about the matter. "Those men in white coats at the Patterson-London fight won't be there to sell peanuts," said Sports Illustrated's Martin Kane. "They will be psychiatrists assembled for the clinical study of one of the most lunatic sporting promotions of our century, surpassing in some aspects even such demented delights as Bunyan debris and dance marathons." In late April, London finally arrived in Indianapolis, and he was his old talkative self. The $75,000 guarantee he received for the fight was the biggest of his career, and he was certainly happy about that. The opportunity to compete for the champion's belt was something he'd never come close to achieving earlier on in his career. He said he would gladly fight Floyd for free, just to have a shot at the crown. He knew that his opponent regarded this as nothing more than a tune-up for his meeting with Johansson, but London predicted that Patterson just might get the surprise of his life. Floyd was no Marciano or Lewis in London's estimation and could be defeated. Patterson may not have been a Marciano or Lewis, and he may have been viewed as a flawed champion by columnists like Jimmy Cannon, but at the time of the London fight, he was held in high esteem by African Americans who considered him a hero. Whilst in Indianapolis in the days before the London bout, Floyd visited the all-black Cus D'Amato High School. Like Southern schools in Midwestern public schools of the time, they were typically racially segregated, and black schools wound up on the losing end of budgetary decisions. Facilities were often substandard, including playing fields and gymnasiums, and there was little money for adequate athletic gear. As a result, black public high school teams often struggled against larger white high schools with more money. But 2 years earlier, Cus D'Amato High School had made national history by becoming the first African American high school to win a state sports championship. Led by the legendary Oscar Robertson, Attucks had come out on top of the equally legendary Indiana State High School basketball tournament. Another Robertson-led Attucks team repeated as champions the next year, becoming the first high school basketball team in Indiana history to go undefeated for the season. Floyd received an enthusiastic welcome from the sports-crazed student body. In particular, he impressed a 15-year-old girl who said, in 1958, on the heels of Little Rock and all the racial turbulence that had engulfed the country in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott, Floyd Patterson was one of the heroes who gave the Negro a sense of power, a conviction that in spite of prejudice and hatred, we could compete and triumph. The visit helped Floyd. Sports writers in town to cover the fight were impressed by his workouts. The consensus among them was that he looked sharper than at any time since the fight with Moore in 1956. Patterson gave Ike Thomas a hard body pumping in Sunday's workout, wrote an Associated Press reporter. He floored him once with a quick left-right combination and then with a hard left hook to the jaw. It seemed likely that London would be in for a hard night. In spite of D'Amato's fears about the lack of publicity, ticket sales turned out to be brisk. About 10,000 fans filed in to Indianapolis's Fairgrounds Coliseum, expecting to see Floyd knock out London in his warm-up for the real fight with Johansson to take place 6 weeks later. Johansson himself was among the VIP seated at ringside. But Floyd wound up fighting methodically, at best against London, showing little inspiration through the first 10 rounds. It was just enough to keep him ahead on the judges' scorecards. Finally, early in the 11th, Patterson went into full attack mode, delivering a flurry of hard punches, topped by a devastating left hook. London went down with a thud, quivered on his back, and then rolled over to kiss the canvas, as an old trainer might say. London remained motionless for more than 30 seconds after the referee signalled him out. Once London's handlers were finally able to get him back on his feet, Patterson raced across the ring and hugged his vanquished foe. Time magazine dismissed the fight as comic opera, a tea and cakes farce from the beginning, it was written. At ringside, Johansson was baffled by what he'd just witnessed. Why had Floyd taken so long to end the fight? Why did he hug London afterwards? What was up with this guy? Well, he shrugged it off and travelled back to Sweden, never guessing that he was about to enter one of the most celebrated rivalries boxing has ever known. Now, just as a side note away from the story, we have actually covered the tale of Patterson and Johansson for our Legendary Nights podcast. Now, if you haven't already heard that, please do go and listen to it. It will act as a really good side episode for Floyd Patterson's career profile, of course. Now, back into the story. And at Urshan Karadag's training facilities in Summit, New Jersey, Floyd felt confident that he would perform better against Johansson than he had against London. In fact, he even quantified it. He'd be 50% better at their Yankee Stadium title fight on June 26, 1959. What that meant was anyone's guess. Did he expect to knock out Johansson in 5 rounds instead of 11 it took him to for London? Patterson had less than 2 months to prepare, but he had never been in better physical condition, so that wasn't too much of a worry. To ensure that Floyd had the mental toughness he needed, D'Amato put him through more than 500 sparring rounds, forcing Floyd to keep battling after he felt spent. No pulling punches at all. Partners left the ring with bloodied noses, blackened eyes and sore torsos. The undefeated Johansson was a bruiser, and Floyd would have to hurt him to win. And so, the sparring ring carnage mounted. When it was finished every day, Floyd retired to the most austere of accommodations. He said, "The single room in which I slept was only a couple of nails above a squatter's shack." It is a hard business. But Johansson didn't see much that was hard about it. Not in the way he approached it, at any rate. While Floyd practiced self-denial in New Jersey, Johansson lived the high life at a resort hotel in the Catskills known as Grossinger's. It was a training camp the likes of which no one had ever seen. Johansson had hired Whitey Bimstein to act as his American trainer. Bimstein's corner pedigree went back to Gene Tunney and beyond, but Bimstein was unable to impose any old-school discipline on Ingo, as Johansson was popularly called an imperious man, not one to forgo life's pleasures. Johansson's notion of training was playing golf, riding horses and swimming. He made frequent trips to New York for entertainment, taking in the comedians appearing at the Terrace Room and going dancing. He imported a chef from a world-class ski lodge to prepare his meals. His parents, his sister, his brother, and his brother's fiancée were enjoying the good life with him in the United States. As was one, Birgit Lundgren, a Swedish beauty who captivated the press covering Johansson's camp. About to make the transition from his secretary to his fiancée, she appeared everywhere with him, nuzzling his ear, fondling his arm, staring into his deep blue eyes. It was clear to everyone who witnessed it that much more than ear nuzzling occurred when the couple was alone in Johansson's room. Rocky Marciano was among the many that was appalled by the spectacle. Could any 2 boxers be more different? It hardly seemed so, and yet the 2 men shared one thing. Neither had ever wanted to be anything but a successful prize fighter. Johansson believed he was born to be a boxer. He had watched prize fighting for the first time at age 12, standing at the top of the Swedish Matshaller, looking down at the spectacle. He was immediately taken by it all. The whole atmosphere of the thing, from boxers themselves to colourful characters outside the ring. After that, boxing was all the Swedish working-class kid could think about. He was a big, strong boy with a physique that set him apart from his classmates. At age 13, he already weighed 141 pounds. A little more than 2 years later, he was fighting as a heavyweight. He looked to a fellow Swede named Ollie Bengtsson, the first boxer he knew by name, as a role model. Bengtsson was a crowd favourite in the small Swedish venues where he boxed, fair-haired, wearing a gold vest and black trunks, and, more important, he seemed to always knock out his opponents. Inspired, Johansson began training in earnest. Eventually, he actually sparred with Bengtsson and discovered that he could supply the older, more experienced fighter with all he could handle. After finishing school, Johansson knocked around, working various odd jobs at the Gothenburg harbour, portering bananas, wrestling sacks, sweeping snow, and then he went to work for Edwin Alquist's Dockside Company. That changed Ingo's life. Alquist was a familiar face in Swedish boxing circles, such as they were. Because of its violence, pro boxing was controversial in Sweden, and politicians debated outlawing it. But Alquist loved prize fighting, and like Cus D'Amato dreamed of taking a heavyweight prospect all the way to a championship title, his attempts at developing a contender had been disappointing. Alquist knew about Johansson's fighting ability before Ingo came to work for him. He saw Ingo in action during amateur fights at Gothenburg's Lorensburg Circus, where he witnessed, for the first time, Ingo's powerful right-hand punches. He saw one such blow connect with the chin of an older boxer. Abruptly, the other man was out. Not staggered, but completely knocked out. Impressed, Alquist introduced himself to the 14-year-old Ingo. A few years later, after Johansson began working for Alquist on the docks, he began managing Ingo's boxing career. Time after time, Alquist witnessed Ingo's dispatching other boxers with that nearly mythical right hand, and he began to think that he actually might have found a ticket to the heavyweight title. As an amateur, Ingo became a phenomenon in Sweden, to a lesser extent internationally. He awed Chicago fight fans in 1951 when he visited with a troupe of European amateurs to battle the city's Golden Glove champs, and he enjoyed positive write-ups in the Chicago papers. Yet on the same tour, he left an entirely different impression on fans in Washington, D.C. Claiming his hand was hurt, he refused to take part in amateur bouts scheduled for the Swedish boxers in the nation's capital. An American official said that Ingo had to fight, at least make a show of it for one round before withdrawing. Ingo refused. Swedish boxing writers, well, they was outraged as well. They accused Ingo of faking his injury because he was afraid to box the American scheduled for him. Well, Johansson didn't listen. He stood his ground, and he later said, "You have to learn to stand up against a campaign of backbiting threats and slanders." He didn't care if he developed a reputation as a fistic prima donna for doing so. Regardless of what happened in Washington, Johansson seemed likely to be a serious contender for the 1952 Olympic gold medal as a heavyweight. He qualified to be a member of Sweden's team. Reluctantly, he viewed the Olympics as something he had to endure before he could begin fighting for money, which was his ultimate goal. But he felt pressured by Alquist and others to take part in the Helsinki Games. He went into camp out of shape and feuded with trainers who attempted to remedy that. He said, "I was regarded by people who never boxed and don't understand boxing as lazy and unwilling to train. I never do well if I'm messed about in this way. It never has suited me." While as Floyd spent his free time in Helsinki smuggling food to the city's impoverished, Johansson spent his at a Finnish golf course. Meanwhile, the luck of the draw worked to Ingo's advantage in the heavyweight boxing brackets. He made it to the medal round, hardly working up a sweat against the less than stellar Olympians he met in the ring. But in the finals, he had to box the counter-punching American, Ed Sanders, a talented amateur who seemed to have a future as a pro fighter. Patterson, well, he was sat at ringside to cheer on his fellow American Olympian. He watched as Johansson rather shamelessly ran from Sanders in the ring. The crowd hooted its disapproval, and the referee warned Johansson for failing to fight. But Ingo continued to try and evade Sanders. Finally, the referee ended the match and disqualified Johansson. Under normal circumstances, the loser of the championship round would have received the silver medal, but because of the disqualification, the Olympic Committee declined to give it to Johansson. The other Swedish boxers did nothing to disguise their disgust at their teammate. Floyd, the patriotic American boxer, could not fathom what he'd just witnessed. To his mind, an Olympic boxer was a representative of his nation. How could Johansson have let his country down this way? Floyd was certain that Johansson had performed the way he did because he was scared of Sanders. But once he had become a pro, immediately after the Helsinki Games, Johansson redeemed himself somewhat to European boxing fans as he notched up win after win. His strong right hand grew even more effective, becoming one of the most devastating right-hand punches heavyweight boxing has ever known. Most of his ring opponents never saw it coming, and never had a chance to react. Except for that one lightning-fast punch. Johansson had no ring speed. In fact, he looked rather awkward when he fought. His jab was substandard, but Johansson felt no need to improve it, since all his moves were subservient to his nearly supernatural, at least in Ingo's mind, right hand. Johansson just let it fly, investing full faith in the punch, to the exclusion of almost everything else in terms of technique. Eventually it gained a name. It flew with the power of lightning and thunder, which came out as a tunda when Johansson pronounced it with his Swedish accent. Floyd discounted the mystique that Alquist and Johansson built up around the thunder. What kind of malarkey was that? A punch so fast it couldn't be seen. A punch that supposedly acted on its own, striking without Johansson even knowing he was throwing it. Ridiculous. I don't want to hear about Johansson's right hand, Patterson told Al Buck of the New York Post. I wouldn't want to be watching the right and get knocked out by a left hook. The more Patterson thought about the theory he'd seen in Johansson's eyes in Helsinki and the absurd legend that had been built up around his right hand, the less respect he felt for the Swedish challenger. As the bout approached, Patterson felt himself getting bored and losing enthusiasm for the fight. The people surrounding Floyd had no idea what was going through his mind. As often was the case, he kept his thoughts buried within himself. To boxing writers, he looked sharp and seemed to have an appropriate mental edge. But deep down, Patterson just wanted to get the fight over and move on to the next one. He and his entourage motored from his camp in New Jersey to Manhattan, where he put up at the Edison Hotel. The weigh-in for the fight occurred on a rainy June 25th across town at the Commodore Hotel. With dozens of sports writers looking on, Patterson tipped the scales at £182 and Johansson at £196. Patterson didn't dawdle afterward to talk to the press. He changed into his street clothes and hurried out to a waiting car. Cus D'Amato, Dan Florio and the other members of the party trailing behind him. "Drive downtown on 3rd Avenue, he said, and then go east on 4th Street. "What's this?" D'Amato said. "I'm late now." "Late for what?" "The graduation." Patterson had made it a point to return to the PS 614 graduation ever since he had received his own diploma from the school for troubled kids. He hadn't missed a single ceremony, and he wasn't going to miss that day's. Never mind that he was scheduled that night to face the toughest opponent yet to challenge him for his heavyweight crown. The ceremony had already begun by the time Patterson rushed into the school. But he was able to present the Floyd Patterson Trophy for sportsmanship, and he went through the lunch line with the other boys. The principal ensured he received an extra carton of milk. After that, the entourage returned to Edison, where word awaited them that the rain had forced the promoters to delay the outdoor fight at Yankee Stadium by a day. Patterson was more anxious than ever to get this fight into the record book. He felt deflated. It rained the next day as well, letting up just an hour before the evening of fights was set to begin. Everything was drenched in the famed stadium and the air was muggy, but the promoters decided not to delay again. Promoter Bill Rosenstone had Yankee Stadium set up to accommodate 80,000 spectators. Seats were expensive too, with ringside going for $100 a pop. But just 21,961 people braved the humid night. After arriving in the Bronx and getting to his dressing room in the soggy house that Ruth built, Patterson still felt bored, missing his usual pre-fight edge. Johansson was in an entirely different state of mind. He had little respect for Patterson as a champion, outside of the difficulty Patterson presented with his unorthodox peekaboo style and his hand speed. Johansson believed that Patterson was no more than an overachieving light heavyweight. Ingo disdained Patterson for so seldom defending his crown and for the quality of his challenges, and he could not fathom that the heavyweight champion of the world would allow himself to be knocked down as much as Patterson did. If other fighters could floor Floyd, so could Johansson. And as his thunder was much more powerful than any weapon Patterson's other challengers possessed. After watching Patterson fight London in Indianapolis, Johansson told Alquist in private that he could knock out the champion of the world. Alquist thought the same thing, but told Johansson not to mention a word of it to anyone. It was their little secret to keep, and the secret remained a secret. Jimmy Cannon suggested that the United Nations should step in to prevent Patterson from slaughtering Johansson, a fighter he considered no better than Brian London, Pete Rademacher or Roy Harris. Johansson discounted whatever Cannon and the rest of the American press had to say about him. He believed the writers were unfriendly to him because he refused to bow down to Americans and their belief that he didn't train with the seriousness the writers thought worthy of a world champion. Johansson would read accounts of his frolicking with Birgit Lundgren in a pool or dancing in New York City nightclubs and shake his head. The American press simply didn't understand him or his ways. He had been confident at the weigh-in, and he was confident and relaxed and cheerful on the night of the fight. In the makeshift canvas-walled dressing room set up for Johansson beneath the boxing stage, he put on his trunks and listened while Dan Florio's brother Nick, representing the Patterson camp, complained that Johansson's belt line was too high. Whitey Bimstein dismissed the complaint and sent Floyd's man packing. It was the typical sort of sniping that goes on before boxing matches. When the time came, Johansson climbed into the ring to enthusiastic applause, which surprised him, given what he'd read about himself in the papers. When Patterson, as champion, entered the ring, Johansson noticed that the applause was scarcely, if any, greater than he himself had received. Perhaps it was an omen. Referee Ruby Goldstein called the two fighters to the centre of the ring and recited the rules of the fight. Johansson didn't listen. He was too busy testing his footing on the ring's odd canvas-covered foam rubber mat. Patterson stood, head bowed, looking at Johansson's shuffling feet. By this point in his career, Floyd avoided stare-downs with his adversaries. In fact, he could not even bring himself to look them in the eye the moments leading up to the first round. How could he be expected to demolish another fighter after he'd seen the light in his eyes? Watching from the press seats was a two-paid attorney from Brooklyn who'd given up practicing law in order to forge a most unlikely career as a sports broadcaster. That man is Howard Cosell. Well, he was making his debut anchoring an ABC radio network broadcast of heavyweight championship fight to a national audience. 5 years earlier, Cosell had been a complete boxing novice. But then, he'd been introduced to Cus D'Amato through W.C. Hines, whom Cosell regarded as the best boxing writer he'd ever read. Thus began Cosell's association with prize fighting. By 1959, Cosell counted D'Amato and Patterson amongst his friends. He said, "I became absorbed with Floyd, with his personal life, his softness, both of manner and voice, the way he would express interest in a variety of things, religion, family, hobbies. He converted to Catholicism and seemed utterly at peace with himself. He was that way then as a fighter. If Cus says I can win, then I can win," he would say. Cosell spent hours with D'Amato and Patterson at their training camps and at the Gramercy gym, and though he had yet to broadcast a fight live, he covered many of Patterson's bouts as an ABC sports reporter, including Floyd's triumph over Archie Moore in Chicago. Though he liked both fighter and manager, Cosell found himself mystified by the ways, including the crude conditions under which Patterson trained. The Gramercy was always run down, but when he saw the primitive, frigid jockey room in which D'Amato had set up Floyd for training at Sportsman's Park in Chicago for the Moore fight, Cosell thought to himself that enough was enough. Cus should have provided Floyd better facilities for a championship bout, but he knew D'Amato would always keep things primal, at least as far as training was concerned. At other times, Cus would be very generous. After Patterson won the heavyweight title, D'Amato showed up at Cosell's apartment to present Cosell with a 100-year-old bottle of alcohol to thank the sports writer for his support. The gesture indicated just how tight the three men had become. United Artists and the Mershik Company sponsored the ABC radio broadcast to promote the movie The Horse Soldiers, which starred William Holden and John Wayne. The Duke was Patterson's favourite actor. Every picture I've ever seen him in, I've liked him, because he's always the good guy cleaning up the town or something. Now, as part of the promotion, Wayne and Holden were positioned at ringside to work the broadcast with Cosell and ABC announcer Les Keiter. Holden confidently told Cosell that Johansson would beat Patterson. Cosell laughed at him. The moment had finally arrived. Patterson raised his gaze from Johansson's feet after Goldstein finished his instructions. He stepped back to his corner, accepting the advice D'Amato and Florio had to offer, uncertain as to how this drama would play out. In his corner, Johansson felt more self-assured than ever, anxious to end the fight as soon as possible. The bell rang, and the two fighters moved forward to begin their battle. Early on, Johansson found Patterson to be vulnerable, particularly to both straight lefts and left hooks. Nothing impressed him about the vaunted Patterson speed when the champ fought from the outside. But when Patterson stepped into the pocket to fight up close, it was a different story. Then, Patterson proved elusive. "You got a smell of him, but no more," Johansson said. Still, Johansson was able to score, and Johansson became convinced that Patterson couldn't punch. He was of too frail calibre. When he went to his corner at the end of the first round, Ingo told his cornerman, "The whole thing is shaping out." Floyd saw things differently. He felt no intimidation at all from Johansson during the first round. He was particularly surprised by Johansson's anemic jabs, all 69 of them. Ingo flicked them as if he were attempting to ward off mosquitoes. They inflicted no real damage on the rare occasion they connected, but Floyd was even more surprised by Johansson's strange defensive tactics, in particular how he jumped backwards to avoid punches. For a heavyweight, Ingo seemed light on his feet. The flickering jabs and rapid retreats were actually part of Johansson's fight strategy. His goal was to confuse Patterson, and by the third round, Ingo believed he was doing just that. As Patterson struggled to adjust to his opponent's odd boxing style, Ingo threw a sharp, short left hook, tagging Patterson, then followed it with a hard, straight right. Thunder caught Patterson, smack in the face, and he was suddenly on the mat. What Floyd described to W.C. Hines as being in the black spot, Patterson was stunned both physically and mentally. After Floyd regained his footing, he decided he had to get aggressive to compensate for the knockdown. It was a mistake. Johansson dispatched Floyd back into that black spot once again. And then it happened once more. Then again. And again. It was a shocking spectacle. The heavyweight champion of the world went down over and over in just 2 minutes. Floyd was completely discombobulated, so much so that at one point he believed that he had knocked down Johansson when it was Floyd himself on the mat. In the swirl of confusion that followed, Patterson arose and attempted to find a neutral corner while starting to take out his mouthpiece, never realising that Ruby Goldstein had signalled for the fight to resume. Ingo clobbered him with a right to the back of the head that sent Floyd sprawling one more time. Floyd just couldn't believe it. He was being pummeled, bullied around the ring, and he couldn't seem to do anything about it. After the fourth knockdown, he looked directly into the eyes of John Wayne. Embarrassment washed over him. The most famous movie star in the world had come all this way to watch him fight, and Floyd was letting him down. The characters that Wayne had played had always seemed to find a way to overcome adversity and win. But Floyd was being humiliated, losing in front of his hometown fans. John Wayne would never allow something like that to happen. That the eyes of the Duke were on him made the thrashing sting all the worse. With a minute left in the third, and after Patterson suffered a jaw-dropping 7 knockdowns, Goldstein finally stepped between the fighters, waved his hands, and awarded Ingo a technical knockout and the title of heavyweight champion of the world. Johansson and his famed punch made believers of many people that night. Columnist John Lardner looked around at the thousands of fans in Yankee Stadium and surmised they'd become Ingo and Thunder converts. He said, "Never before has a prize fight been so completely identified with one symbol, a thoroughly advertised right hand." "Best right hand punch I ever saw," said Rocky Marciano, who was at ringside. "Quite a sock," said former champ Jack Dempsey, also at ringside that night. Howard Cosell hustled into the ring. He found D'Amato and placed his microphone in front of him. D'Amato, placidly confident, said, "Floyd Patterson will become the first heavyweight champion to ever regain his title." But Floyd was hearing other things. Patterson had not even reached his dressing room yet when he found himself surrounded by hostile fans. He saw a man with a big smile who shouted to another, "See, I told you, this guy can't fight." Among the friends, family and boxing officials waiting in the dressing room was a member of the New York State Athletic Commission who was laughing out loud. When he spotted Dan Florio coming through the door with Patterson, he said, "So, your boy finally got it." Florio loosened his grip on Floyd's arm and started for the official, but Buster Watson interceded before blows could be exchanged. Floyd's handlers quickly cleared the crowd out, and Floyd had a few moments to try and make sense of what had just happened. He felt numb. He understood that he was no longer champion of the world, but he couldn't grasp why. He didn't even bother to shower. Soap and water wouldn't wash away what had happened, he said. Had it been possible, Patterson would have kept that dressing room door closed, but he couldn't do that. He still had to admit reporters for the traditional post-fight question and answer session. Though Patterson was not a man who favoured hats, he asked to borrow Watson's as if pulling the brim down over his eyes would prevent reporters from seeing his pain. It was a vain tactic. His sorrow was all too apparent. Once the door opened, D'Amato took charge. He said, "We never criticise a referee," he said, when asked if Goldstein had stopped the fight too soon, but he then added, "I do feel, though, that when the fight was stopped, Floyd was beginning to pull out of it. But in all fairness, we could not blame the referee for ending it. He said the devastation began with a left hook followed by a looping right that came out of nowhere. It was a bolt out of the blue, D'Amato said. Floyd never saw it coming, so he can't describe it, but I did. It hit him flush and high on the face. Patterson, though feeling humiliated by the loss, managed some humour. When asked if the Johansson right was the hardest punch he'd ever taken, he said, "Evidently so." But the dethroned champion felt already drowned deep inside. He didn't really have anything else to say to the reporters, so it was back to D'Amato, who said that, yes, of course, Floyd Patterson would exercise the return bout clause in the fight contract. Where and when? Well, we'll have to see about that. Johansson suddenly appeared in Floyd's dressing room, escorted by police officers. The new world champion shook hands with the man he had just disposed. The handshake was sincere, but not a word was spoken between the two men. Then Ingo departed to celebrate his new crown, Patterson to mourn all that he had lost. Floyd was 24 years old, and the most important thing in the world to him had just been whisked away. Was there any way that he could get it back? Well, once he returned home, Floyd found some solitude during the dark hours after the fight. It was late at night, but he remained awake, mentally replaying everything that had happened in Yankee Stadium, chastising himself as he pondered all the people across America he'd let down. He was also thinking about his immediate family. He now had another daughter, Trina, to go along with his first daughter, Seneca, and his wife, Sandra. It was clear by now that Floyd was not a man to put his family first in terms of emotional commitment. His career took centre stage, but he was not one to neglect them financially. He knew his wife and two small daughters depended on him. In addition, he knew that millions of African Americans had placed their faith in him. Hoping he would have a long run as heavyweight champ, maybe even prove to be the next Joe Louis, that dream was now shattered. After dawn, Patterson finally made it to bed. He awakened a few hours later to a blood-soaked pillow. Sandra drove him to see an ear, nose and throat specialist who diagnosed a punctured eardrum, a painful souvenir of Johansson's power punches. Back at home, Patterson went straight to the den and turned on the TV. He stared at it, without seeing what was on the screen. But Sandra was not content to let things lie. Striding into the room, she turned the set off and suggested that Patterson consider retiring from the ring. Floyd could not believe what he'd heard. No, he said, not after just this one defeat. But Sandra, witnessing the battering he'd taken and seeing how morose he was now, asserted that it wasn't necessary for him to continue. The family had plenty of money for the time being, she argued, and she could find a job if finances grew tight. Floyd was having none of it. Definitely, he said, this is not the time to quit. He owed it to himself and the fans to fight again. Their conversation ended there, but the issue was far from resolved. The endless training camps, the travel, all that time Patterson spent away from home, it had taken its toll on the Patterson family. In the days after the Johansson fight, Floyd went free-falling into darkness. He remained holed up in his house, drapes drawn, lights off. For hours at a time he lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling while the TV droned unheeded. He couldn't sleep. Floyd, the man who could doze off anywhere, any time, under any circumstances. His children were wondering if the daddy was sick. Maybe he was. He wallowed in despair, haunted by the memory of John Wayne's eyes. The night of the fight, Howard Cosell had gone home to find his 13-year-old daughter, Jill, still up, weeping over Floyd's defeat. She ended up crying all night. Many Americans shared Jill Cosell's sentiments in the following days, but many others did not. In fact, most of the world seemed to be celebrating Patterson's dethronement. It wasn't just the big city writers who regularly covered boxing who weighed in on what happened at Yankee Stadium that night, taking their jabs in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. In Florence, South Carolina, local columnist Ernie Pravat hailed Johansson as a boxer who could give boxing a big boost in the United States. He said, "He's an exciting fighter, with a powerful punch, and from every indication will be a fighting champion." The implication was that Patterson was not a fighting champion, that he avoided tough challengers, didn't fight often enough. Older boxers offered their opinions as well. Former heavyweight champion Gene Tunney who had never proved to be shy when given an opportunity to criticise Patterson, said, "I always considered Patterson a built-up novice, but this Johansson, he is a real fighter." Tunney added that he personally was glad Johansson had won. The first reporter to visit Patterson during these dark days was Milton Gross from the New York Post. There was not a visible sign of the beating he had taken on his face, Gross said, but there was a subdued sadness in his eyes and in his voice. Patterson told Gross he felt as if he were caught up in some sort of dreadful non-reality. He wondered if he'd ever been the heavyweight champion at all, or was it just something he dreamt of? He then made a curious suggestion. Floyd would talk more if that's what Gross wanted, or he'd rather they just sit there quietly in the house. Floyd now referred to as a funeral parlour. Cus D'Amato, fretting about Patterson's deepening depression, asked Cassell to drive to Rockville Centre to cheer Floyd up. Cassell immediately agreed, and with a spark of inspiration suggested taking Jackie Robinson along. D'Amato thought it was a splendid idea and called Floyd up to set up the visit. At 9 a.m. the next day, Howard Cassell and Jackie Robinson stood at Floyd's door. No man stood higher in Patterson's estimation than Jackie Robinson. Patterson was a lifelong Dodgers fan. Even before Robinson was called up to the team in 1947, young Patterson kept scrapbooks devoted to the Dodgers. Once Robinson broke Major League Baseball's colour barrier, he stood next to Joe Louis at the very top of Patterson's list of heroes. Robinson comported himself with dignity and strength, a polite man of virtue who commanded respect. There was no small amount of abuse hurled Robinson's way as the first African-American to play in the big leagues since the 1800s, yet he withstood it, and he proved that a black man could be a standout player in Major League Baseball. Robinson's pride and poise inspired Floyd, and the ball player once nicknamed the Coloured Comet was the perfect person to minister to him during the bleak hours that followed his defeat. But for a time after Robinson and Cassell arrived at the Patterson house, it appeared that they might not even get beyond the front door. From the outside it looked unoccupied, Cassell said. All the blinds were drawn, we rang and rang again, and finally Sandra appeared and let us in. Floyd tried to avoid looking at us in the eye. It was as if he was sitting in that little hole in the subway once again. Robinson and Patterson discussed comebacks. Robinson outlined his own and suggested that Floyd had youth on his side. To Cassell, Floyd seemed to perk up. Robinson and Patterson's friendship was cemented that day. From that afternoon onwards, whenever Robinson called for his help, Floyd would be there for him. "I always get sort of choked up," Robinson would say, "when I try to express how I feel about him." Although Cassell believed that Patterson felt better after the visit, Floyd's days of anguish were far from over. As each one slowly slid by, D'Amato and Dan Florio made stops at the house to assure Floyd that he'd get a rematch. Negotiations were underway, and that they believed Floyd would show the world that Ingo was no champion, that what had happened at Yankee Stadium was a fluke. But such assurances didn't make things better. What did clear the gloomy clouds away, at least for a few days, came from an unexpected source. Archie Moore sent Floyd Patterson a letter that was kind and encouraging yet blunt, and it reads, "Dear Floyd, the first bout is over. I know how you must feel. I hope you don't continue to feel bad. The same thing has happened to many great fighters. Of course, I hated to lose to you, and fate decreed it that way. Fate does strange seeming things. If you are a believer in things that happen for the best, listen to this, and you can find your way out of a seeming tunnel. First, Johansson was not so great. You fought a stupid battle. Look at the film, evaluate it. Never once did you lead with a jab. All you did was move your feet and try to leap towards him. Now this man was not like London. He could bang a little. You gave absolutely no respect to your opposition. But if he had been the banger the press said he was, he would have put you away with the left hook he hit you with, your back turned. Well, if you concentrate on your jab and move around this guy, you will be the first one to regain the crown. You can do it. Your friend, Archie Moore." Of course, Moore was right. There was nothing mystical about Johansson and his thunder. It was just that fighter after fighter had made the same mistake with Johansson that Patterson had made. They all fought stupid fights, allowing Johansson to lure them into his style of boxing. That was how Ingo wound up undefeated, and that was how he wound up with Patterson's title. Patterson put Moore's letter down and looked up at a golden crown D'Amato had presented to him when Floyd had won the championship. Floyd lifted it down from the mantle and detached it from its base. Then he hid it out of sight. He decided he was not entitled to have it on display while Johansson held the title. If Patterson could win back the championship, the crown would see the light of day once again. For the first time in weeks, Floyd believed he had a chance to reclaim it. Sports writers speculated that a rematch could occur as early as September 1960, just 3 months after their first bout. Patterson's experiences with D'Amato's complicated and protracted fight negotiations had taught him it would be much later than that. But that was it being discussed already meant that there was an opportunity for redemption, and it awaited him. Many people hoped there would be no redemption for Floyd Patterson. By the millions, Americans were paying money to watch the Johansson fight at local movie houses. The showings seemed especially popular in the South, where one theatre promoted the film as footage as the most exciting fight in history. The images of the Swede's humiliation of the African-American champion no doubt appealed to the segregationist element in the region, as did the comments of Newspaper Enterprise Association writer Harry Grayson, who called Patterson the most overrated and overprotected fighter ever to wear the heavyweight crown, and the greatest hoax since the Cardiff Giant. Grayson's column, like many NEA features, appeared regularly in small-town dailies across America, including the South. Sometimes the exuberant celebration of Johansson's win had an ugly undertone. In one small southern town, the owner of a movie house exhibiting the fight footage advertised it with a sign portraying a triumphant white boxer standing over a fallen black boxer, a racial caricature featuring exaggerated white lips. The celebration of Johansson's victory in the rest of the United States seemed suspect as well. He seemed to be on everyone's broadcast, from Ed Sullivan's to Jackie Gleason's to Dinah Shore's, sometimes showing off his ability to sing. News magazine photographers mobbed Ingo, snapping pictures of the champ with a striking Birgit Lundgren, especially relishing opportunities to shoot her poolside clad in a bikini. Ingo found himself cast with Alan Ladd, Sidney Poitier, James Darren and Mort Sahl in a Korean war drama called All the Young Men, and he sang in the now largely forgotten movie. Ingo was named Athlete of the Year in a poll conducted by the Associated Press, beating out Johnny Unitas, who had just led the Baltimore Colts to their second consecutive NFL championship. Johansson's big year was topped off when Sports Illustrated named him its Sportsman of the Year. Well, Americans love it when an underdog emerges victorious, but only a naive observer would conclude that the adoration Johansson received during the last half of 1959 was based entirely on his athletic prowess. When Patterson, an underdog, knocked out Archie Moore to become heavyweight champion in 1956, the parade of opportunities made available to him was slight compared to what Johansson received. Hollywood didn't come calling Floyd to sing in any movies. Had it been a Zora Foley or an Eddie Machen, a Cleveland Big Cat Williams or any other African-American boxer who had floored Patterson 7 times in one round, he would not have been pursued by gossip columnists and magazine photographers the way Johansson was. It's clear that race played a larger role in Johansson's celebrity status. Reading between the lines, one can detect that writers of a certain age considered Jack Dempsey the last great white champion. As far for Gene Tunney, Max Schmeling, Jack Sharkey, Primo Carnera, Max Baer and James J. Braddock, none of them held the title long enough to be considered great. Marciano, well, he was Italian-American and perhaps too suave. But Dempsey was a solidly white American, and columnists like the NEA's Harry Grayson went well out of the way to liken Johansson to Dempsey. Dempsey was the last champion to knock down a challenger 7 times in a round, so it was easy for writers to rationalise a bridge between the young Viking and the Manasseh Mauler who refused to fight black contenders once he became champion in 1919. Floyd came out of what he called his black mood as he was sitting in his darkened den one night. In the late 1950s, TV stations signed off after airing a late movie. The sign-off involved the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. When the national anthem ended, the TV was reduced to a slow, fading grey dot, and soft hissing from the speaker. Floyd would later say that as he watched the dot, he thought about a girl he'd once met who was dying of leukemia. He reflected on how lucky he was in comparison to the stricken girl and her family. He arose from the couch and stepped over to a window where he watched the dawn. He decided it was time to get on with his life and win back his title. That night, he and Sandra went to a movie, not in his comfortable suburb, but in the city, the place where he'd lost his title. He'd lost track of just how many weeks had passed since that disastrous night at Yankee Stadium, but summer had given away to the chill of autumn when he decided he was ready to begin trading again. He was anxious to get started. Floyd would prepare for the Johansson rematch, fired by an emotion foreign to him. He hated the new heavyweight champion of the world, and he planned to take that hatred into the ring with him. It would take 6 days short of a full calendar year before the rematch took place, and then only after weeks of scandalous newspaper headlines about D'Amato's involvement with organised crime. At the time, Cus credited himself with breaking the back of the International Boxing Club. In fact, the IBC was dissolved in January 1959 under orders of the US Supreme Court, and its demise had little, if anything, to do with D'Amato's war against it. The IBC died under the weight of the federal Sherman Antitrust Act. Prosecutors were successful in sending the IBC's leaders to prison without D'Amato ever once providing testimony to a grand jury or otherwise aiding the government, even though other boxing managers did so. In fact, investigators discovered that D'Amato privately took loans of $15,000 and $5,000 from the IBC's Jim Norris in 1956, the year Patterson won the championship. D'Amato's other business dealings in the mid to late 1950s turned out to be scarcely pure. D'Amato certainly knew that Bill Rosensohn had a gambling habit when Cus brought him in as a promoter. Often in debt, Rosensohn did not have the cash on hand needed for the guarantees for the first fight with Johansson. He turned to a friendly bookie for advice. The bookie referred Rosensohn to Genevieve's crime family leader, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. Now Salerno, though later infamous, was virtually unknown to law enforcement at the time. Rosensohn managed to cut a deal for Salerno to provide the upfront money for the Johansson fight in exchange for a share of the profits. One problem existed. A friend of D'Amato's named Charlie Black already was under contract to receive 50% of the net. Black and D'Amato's relationship went back to their boyhood days in the Bronx. Friendship aside, Black was valuable to D'Amato because Black was himself a gangster, a convicted loan shark with deep underworld connections. Black had secretly been involved in the underside of D'Amato's dealings as far back as the 1958 fight with Cut-and-Shoot Harris. For reasons never clear, Black received 50% of the profit from that fight. A clause in the fight contract required Harris, if he won, to take on Black as his manager. Black relinquished his claim to any percentage of the first Johansson fight in exchange for 1/3 ownership of Rosensohn's promotion company. Salerno himself took another third of the company for the money he gave Rosensohn. All of this placed D'Amato in a bad light when it became public. The man who cast himself as the champion to clean up boxing was now shown to have consorted with two big-time gamblers and a shadowy mafia figure. It was the scandal of D'Amato's own making that prompted US Senator Estes Kiefer, a Tennessee Democrat famous for his organised crime investigations, to direct his subcommittee towards prize fighting in September 1959. In addition, a New York State grand jury began hearing testimony about a possible wrongdoing in boxing. Once the newspaper stories broke, Johansson's team demanded a full financial accounting of the first fight before it agreed to move forward with the negotiations for the second. Finally, the New York State Athletic Commission admonished D'Amato for attempting to wrest control of the heavyweight division by acting as both manager and promoter. The commission also attempted to revoke D'Amato's manager's license, but D'Amato played a gambit that ultimately blocked the commission from doing so. He purposely had not renewed his license application. Subsequent court decisions held that a license that had expired could not be revoked. D'Amato left New York for Puerto Rico, where he stayed under an assumed name. He refused to testify before the grand jury or the Kiefer committee. What did D'Amato know And when did he know it? Asked Monlith Illingworth. Perhaps he didn't conspire to drive Rosenstone to Salerno and Black. Maybe Rosenstone was just a loose cannon, moved by his own inexperience, bad judgment and greed. D'Amato apparently never discussed the details of what happened with anyone. It's hard to believe, however, that a man so obsessed with control would not have known about the Salerno-Black connection. Jose Torres, at the time making his way up the professional boxing ranks to become D'Amato's next contender, later agreed with Illingworth's assessment. As the legal and regulatory drama played out in the newspapers, Patterson began to train for his rematch with Johansson, scheduled for June 20th, 1960. But he was not blind to what was being reported in the newspapers. Patterson's distrust of D'Amato, which had its roots in Cus's mishandling of the London fight contracts, continued to grow, even as he prepped hard to fight Johansson again. Floyd felt good getting back in shape after all those days on the couch. He thrived in the outdoors and seclusion at his upstate New York camp near Roaring Brook. Unfortunately, he couldn't train there for long. The facility closed once the weather turned frosty, so he relocated to a gym in Westport, Connecticut, which at first seemed to be a workable site. But word of his choice for a training headquarters spawned a local newspaper interest in D'Amato's behind-the-scenes shenanigans. Patterson picked up the Westport Daily paper and read the headline, "Boxing Gangsters Invade Westport." That was it for him. He departed the community before the day was out. Patterson and his entourage moved 30 miles inland to Newtown and set up shop in an out-of-business La Ronde roadhouse owned by the once-famous bandleader Enric Madriguera. The dance floor became the gym, furnished overnight with speed bags, heavy bags, mirrors for shadow boxing and exercise mats. Patterson engaged himself in a tough conditioning routine that involved chopping wood, running and repeating heavy bag drills. But he was not happy with his surroundings. When Howard Cosell and his wife Emmy came calling, he vented. Patterson told Cosell, "Nothing but rats. I complained to the owner, and he said there were no rats in the house. I got a gun, shot 3 rats, and hung them up on the line in front of the house where he lives." Rats weren't Floyd's only worry. He was concerned about being what he called glove-shy, where the fear of being knocked out again would hinder his ability to box effectively. He began sparring in the rat-infested roadhouse, and while that went well, sparring was just sparring. He needed to step up the challenge. So, Floyd asked D'Amato back from Puerto Rico and acting as an advisor to arrange a 2-week exhibition tour in Canada. Patterson fought 10 times, and he felt completely satisfied that whatever glove shyness he might have had dissipated by the time he returned to camp. Yet one thing still troubled Floyd. He couldn't bring himself to watch the film of the Johansson fight. Whenever Dan Florio suggested the time was right to take a look at it, Patterson would say, "Next week." And then when next week arrived, Floyd of course would postpone it again. He just couldn't confront Johansson, either as an image on film or TV, or even as a real person. But Johansson seemed to be everywhere. Word arrived at Patterson's camp that Ingo would be appearing in a TV adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's The Killers. Patterson had no interest in watching it, just as he'd eschewed watching his foe when Johansson sang with Dinah Shore on her popular TV show. Floyd assumed the other members of his camp would join him in avoiding the telecast. But then, as he and some others were playing cards, Patterson heard a Swedish voice coming from the TV set in an adjacent room. Patterson walked into the room to find his younger brother Raymond, who had recently joined Buster Watson and Dan Florio in Patterson's training corps, taking in the made-for-TV movie. Floyd thought about leaving, but then he sat down next to his brother. At first, he kept his head bowed, staring at the floor, listening to Johansson's smooth delivery. Then, finally, he made himself look at the screen. And there, Floyd saw, in stark shades of grey, the man who had taken so much from him, proving that he could be a decent enough actor. Patterson pondered why he had avoided Johansson for so long. It wasn't fear, he determined. No, it was shame and hate. In fact, hatred filled his mind. He said, "Some people think you have to hate to be a champion fighter. I never hated an opponent, except once. That was Ingemar. Between the first and second fight, I hated him for a whole year, not because he beat me the first time, but because of his boasting on the Ed Sullivan programme. Hatred alone, however, was not going to get the job done against Johansson. Dan Florio decided it was time for Floyd to reassess his fighting style. In the makeshift gym, he told Patterson to assume his characteristic peekaboo stance. Patterson did as instructed, hands high on his head, body squared up to Florio's. Florio placed his hands on Patterson's shoulders and pushed. Floyd nearly fell down. "You see," Florio said, "you're not right. You've got bad balance. Let's go back to the book. Left foot out front, angle 45 degrees. Left hand out front, angle 45 degrees. Right hand straight up and down. Now you've got leverage. The jab got to come better. Now try it and see what you think." Patterson, he tried it, and he liked it. Fighting out of a conventional stance became the focus of the remainder of the training camp, with Florio shouting at Patterson every time Floyd strayed. Visitors to Floyd's camp found a remade man with a remade boxing style. They liked what they saw. The licenseless D'Amato was absent, as the Black Despair Patterson had suffered through, prevented from working either as a manager or a cornerman. Observers on the scene believed this to be a good turn of events. Floyd seemed more relaxed and confident, with Cus in exile. In April, Patterson matter-of-factly told one reporter that he was his own manager now. This was within the context of the Times, a shocking statement. Patterson confessed he still considered D'Amato a friend, and he said that he was now receiving some business advice from Julius November. Julius November was a tough New York attorney who was best known publicly for his unsuccessful legal manoeuvres to keep the New York Giants baseball team from moving to San Francisco. But Patterson was also stating for the world that he was now his own man. Even greats like Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano had never boldly declared they were their own managers. Patterson's taking charge of his career was a landmark event in the evolution of black athletes. "You see," Floyd said, "I feel I'm mature now. It's like weight. It came naturally. I had no special program. I just grew to 190 and my neck went to size 17. It's the same with my attitude. I always used to know what I felt. I knew that. All right. But I had trouble expressing myself. Now I can do it, and I don't need anybody to do it for me. I'll fight anybody regardless of name or affiliations. I'm tired of arguments." It was not entirely a clean break. Newspapers typically reported D'Amato to be Patterson's manager even after Floyd announced he was managing himself. Even loquacious compared to the champ, D'Amato continued to be interviewed by sports writers and seemed to speak for Patterson, even though he may have not spoken to Floyd for weeks. By this time, Julius November had more influence on Patterson than D'Amato. It had been Cus who first brought November into Patterson's business dealings, but as time went on, November began to seem like he was D'Amato's rival. It was November who ultimately was winning Floyd's trust and not D'Amato. But November did not want anyone to assume he had become de facto manager. He told Jimmy Breslin, "Don't get any incorrect ideas about the situation. Floyd Patterson is a client, and as a client, he has his own mind. And let me tell you, this boy has his own mind." Patterson said, "When I talked to Cus about these terrible things which I had so much trouble understanding as they came out one after the other, I just formed my own answer. How many agreements were there before that I didn't know about?" D'Amato stayed away from Floyd's training camp in Newtown, but he telephoned once or twice a week. Floyd got on the phone only when he believed D'Amato had something important to tell him. Otherwise, the call was handled by Dan Florio. Shortly before the fight, D'Amato finally made an appearance at Newtown, but the relationship between mentor and protege seemed strained. In his early days, Red Smith said of the situation in 1960, Patterson was brainwashed by Cus D'Amato. Today, D'Amato is manager in only one sense. He still gets a cut of the purse. Floyd's contractual obligations to Cus ensured that D'Amato would receive the manager's percentages of his ring earnings for the next few fights, even if D'Amato contributed little or nothing. In addition to November, another lawyer was playing an increasingly important role in Patterson's professional life, Roy Cohn. Cohn was famous, some might say infamous, in 1960. He had become a darling of American conservatives for his work with the red-baiting US Senator Joseph McCarthy for his role in the communist espionage convictions of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and for his work in bringing down Alger Hiss. He was a formidable foe in the courtroom, yet he was a physically unimposing figure. No one you'd expect to find butting heads with promoters and matchmakers in pro boxing. Yet he was doing just that in 1960. He was the power behind Feature Sports Inc., which acquired Bill Rosenstone's promotion company after Rosenstone's connections with organised crime became public knowledge. With this, Cohn essentially became the promoter of the second Patterson-Johansson fight. Feature Sports turned out, like most of Cohn's business ventures, to be anything but ordinary. He installed his law partner as treasurer of the new organisation and travel agent Bill Fugazi, who had known Cohn since their school days as supervising director. But as with many Cohn-directed operations, contention soon ruled. Sometimes the principals resorted to fisticuffs to settle disputes. From the sidelines, Cus D'Amato thought they were a terrible bunch, guilty of bringing a kind of Wall Street sleaziness to boxing, which to him was even worse than that associated with the likes of Fat Tony Salerno. Despite the dysfunction of his business practices, Cohn and his partners stood to make a good deal of money from Patterson-Johansson too. In addition to New York, cities desiring to host the fight included Los Angeles, Chicago and Dallas, where American Football League founder and Dallas Texans owner Lamar Hunt wanted to stage it at the Cotton Bowl. In the end, New York won out, with the match set to take place at the Polo Grounds. In May 1960, Feature Sports announced it had hired Joe Louis as a consultant for the Johansson rematch. One of his duties was to advise Floyd on how to avoid the mistakes he made in the first fight. The legend that Johansson was the next Dempsey still flourished, with Johansson a heavy favourite to demolish Floyd. Perhaps if Patterson received some guidance from the great Louis, fans might think the match could turn out to be closer. It seemed that Feature Sports took Louis on for the Louis name more than any precise services the ex-champ could actually provide, and Louis, always in need of money, was more than happy with the arrangement. As a publicity stunt, it worked. Louis's visit to Newtown generated headlines, but that visit turned out to be more than just PR. "I have been studying the pictures of the first fight between Johansson and Patterson," Louis said, "and I think I have found something. I think I can show Floyd how to win." Louis did, in fact, lay out a sound blueprint for Patterson. Floyd should crowd Johansson at every opportunity, never allow Ingo a chance to throw a big right-hand punch. It was the only way to beat a heavy hitter. Louis said Floyd should take Ingo to the ropes from the get-go and never let him escape. He also told Floyd not to wait any longer before he saw the film of the first Johansson fight. So Floyd took these words to heart, in spite of the fear he felt about watching it, and the two champions viewed the film together. As the projector rattled and the black and white images flickered on the screen, Louis told Floyd that Ingo's power was overrated. He pointed out one of the knockdowns which occurred when Johansson tagged Floyd directly on the nose. If Ingo was a true power puncher, Floyd would have been knocked out. But Patterson was able to get back on his feet. Also, Louis thought Johansson's ring demeanour was that of an excited amateur and not a true pro, a flaw a seasoned boxer like Patterson could exploit. Finally, Louis told Floyd that referee Ruby Goldstein had committed crucial errors. So Louis recommended that Floyd demand a different ref for the next fight. Floyd agreed to insist on a change. Louis left Patterson's training camp after predicting to the press that Floyd would become the first boxer ever to regain the heavyweight championship. If Ingemar Johansson held much concern about the outcome of the bout, he didn't show it, not even on the night before the fight, a time when fighters typically retreat from all but necessary contact with the outside world to focus on what is to come the next day. The evening of June 19th, Johansson showed up at 229 West 53rd Street at 10 o'clock, entered through the stage door of the CBS studio located there, and basked in the TV lights of the hugely popular quiz show, What's My Line? He didn't make much of an attempt to fool the show's panellists about his real identity. "I'll go to bed right after this," he said afterwards. "If I go to sleep too early, I can't sleep very well. Anyway, this is relaxing for me. It's fun." When asked how he felt going into the fight, he simply said, "I feel strong." Birgit Lundgren was at Johansson's side. How did she feel? I feel nothing, she said. With that, the glitter couple of the moment climbed in to the Cadillac awaiting them and sped away into the New York night. Patterson, meanwhile, spent some of that evening with Howard Cosell, taping the pre-fight show. Cosell saw fury in Floyd as Patterson predicted he would beat the new champ with left hooks. Patterson had plenty to seethe about. One of the press reports out of Grossinger's, where Johansson had again been training, had quoted the new champion as saying he thought that Patterson was afraid of him. Johansson also dismissed Patterson as a mere gymnasium fighter. Patterson confronted the reporter who'd written the latter story and asked if Johansson really had said that. The reporter offered to show Patterson his notebook. Floyd demurred, but he'd been fuming since. Floyd would need that curtness and meanness to do what had never been done. James J. Corbett, Bob Fitzsimmons, Jim Jeffries, Jack Dempsey, Max Schmeling, Joe Louis, Ezard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott were all deposed or retired heavyweight champions who had attempted to reclaim their crowns, and all had failed. Would Floyd be able to accomplish what they'd been unable to do? Oddsmakers didn't think so. Bookies took bets with Patterson as an 8-5 underdog. As the gates opened to long lines on June the 20th, promoters expected around 30,000 people to stream into the famed bathtub-shaped stadium, which was now dilapidated following years of poor maintenance. With ringside tickets going for $100 apiece, the box office take was projected to come in at around $750,000. In addition, 230 theatres were set up to carry the closed-circuit telecast of the rematch. Promoters estimated the fight could gross around $2 million and maybe as much as $3.5 million, with each fighter getting 35% of the gross. Among the spectators who wormed their way up to the front was a stocky, balding, white-haired man in a black Homburg who sat close to the ring apron. From seat 1, row 1, section 20, Cus D'Amato would be able to clearly see as the fighters entered the ring. He had kept a low profile in the days leading up to the night, fearing that the controversy that had sprung up around him following the first Johansson match and the conflict with the New York State Athletic Commission over his licence might hurt ticket sales. D'Amato felt confident that Patterson was making progress and would win the rematch. After the fight, he said, "I'll climb into the ring as the crowd acclaims Floyd Patterson as the first heavyweight champion to regain his title." Perhaps it was D'Amato's snaky logic, or perhaps it was simple rationalisation, but he'd come to believe that it had been necessary for Patterson to lose to Johansson. He'd always promised Patterson that he would be the greatest champion in the history of the heavyweight ranks. How could Floyd be the greatest champion unless he lost the crown and then regained it? The polo grounds and the neighbourhood surrounding it seemed as if it might turn into a battleground. The 8th Avenue entrance was jammed with people, many of whom were shoving their way towards the ticket stand. When it was announced over the loudspeaker that all 10,000 upper stand seats were going for $5 each, had been sold. Only 35 ticket takers were on hand to serve the people who did manage to get a ticket. Finally, the frustrated fans, both those who'd failed to get tickets and those with tickets who were upset with the slowness of the ticket takers, had had enough, and a riot broke out. 2 gates were broken down, and outraged fans desperate to see the fight attempted to scale the walls of the stadium. Within a few minutes, though, the 200 New York City police officers on hand, aided by contract security forces, managed to get the unruly crowd under control. Just prior to the opening bell, the polo grounds went surreal as fashion models passed out orchids and perfume samples to the women at ringside. To the men they distributed samples of Wash and Dry, the Miracle Moist Towelette. "This is what I call class, really class," said a woman upon receiving the perfume and orchid. "This is what's needed to bring people like us back to boxing." The fedora-wearing gangsters who dominated boxing behind the scenes in previous years must have been stupefied. The 2 fighters met at the centre of the ring. For the first time, Floyd weighed 190 pounds going into a fight, 8 pounds heavier than he had been when he first battled Johansson. All the new weight was muscle, giving Floyd an imposing presence. Patterson glanced up at Ingo and saw something that surprised him. Fear. "I could see it in his eyes," he said. "His eyes told me that he knew I meant business. He knew. He just knew." When the bell rang, Floyd came out in conventional stance instead of the peekaboo. This was no surprise. His intentions had been reported in the papers weeks before the fight, yet Johansson was perplexed by the change. Patterson followed Joe Lewis's advice and crowded Ingo from the beginning, while Ingo flicked jabs and awkwardly stepped backwards to avoid Floyd's inside attack. But Floyd's punches were finding the mark. After just 3 minutes, Johansson's left eye was red and swollen. In the second round, Johansson unleashed a heavy right that crashed into Patterson's jaw. The crowd roared his approval and delight when Patterson absorbed the blow and continued to throw down, phased but unbroken. Patterson resumed his attacks after the brief setback. At times, Johansson looked defenceless against Floyd's speed, lightning besting thunder. Floyd effectively landed combinations or left hooks to the body, followed almost immediately by left hooks to the head. He was able to slip many of Johansson's responding punches. Chris Schenkel providing the commentary for teleprompter's film of the fight said, "It's obvious Patterson's chances ride on his left hooks. It's not only his best punch, but it is also forcing Johansson to use his best hand, his right, defensively." In the fifth round, Floyd stunned Ingo with a hard left hook to the body. Johansson flipped a couple of ineffective jabs in Patterson's direction, allowing his right hand to slip downward. Patterson immediately pounced on the opportunity. He smashed a left hook into the right side of Johansson's head and sent the man who had taken his crown a year earlier tumbling to the floor. On his knees, Johansson gulped air while the referee counted to 9. Then Johansson rose to his feet, his eyes wide open, shock painted on his face. Floyd went into full attack mode, all the anger, all the hatred, all the resentment now on full display. He battered Johansson viciously, showing a side of himself that he'd never before revealed in the ring. A stunned Ingo could do nothing more than attempt to tie up Floyd in clinches, but the referee refused to allow Johansson to get away with it. Then, with just over a minute left in the fifth round, Patterson struck Ingo squarely on the jaw with a picture-perfect left hook, one that boxing historians would marvel at for decades to come. Johansson went down like a stricken deer at a slaughterhouse. Even before he hit the canvas, it was clear he would not be getting up. He lay there completely out, one foot trembling. Patterson knew what he had accomplished with that blow. The man who'd suffered so much self-torture over the previous year could not contain himself. Floyd danced briefly in the neutral corner, electric with the knowledge that the title belonged to him once more. When the count was over, Patterson shouted, "I showed you!" to the naysaying press at their post along the apron. After that, he rushed to Johansson, who had yet to move except for the shaking foot. Patterson knelt, gave him a quick embrace, and promised him a rematch. But there was no way Johansson could have heard him. Cosell, who'd scurried into the ring, nabbed Patterson for an interview. Then the sportscaster turned and saw Johansson, still out, blood oozing from his mouth. Cosell became alarmed. "For God's sake, Whitey," he said to Whitey Bimstein, who had again worked as Johansson's cornerman, "is he dead?" "Well, the son of a bitch should be," Bimstein answered. "I told him to look out for that left hook." Cosell stared down at Johansson's switching foot. He saw not a top-ranked champion, but a demolished, overmatched fighter. Patterson, who had spent most training with a burning loathing for Johansson, was staring at the fighter he'd just crushed. Floyd's jubilation from just moments earlier gave way to horror. With trainers and the ring doctor tending to him, Johansson spent 4 minutes stretched out on the canvas before he began to stir. Johansson was alive, but far from well. Another 3 minutes followed, with the deposed Swedish champ planted on his stool in the corner of the ring, oblivious to what was going on around him. Finally, he was helped to his dressing room, where he remained unresponsive, through at least conscious. Patterson told author and Sports Illustrated Pro Sports Delante, George Plimpton, that he resolved to never again inflict as much damage on another fighter as he had done on Johansson at the Polo Grounds. Floyd's dominance in the fight suggests that he possessed a thorough confidence that he would defeat Johansson, but Floyd hadn't been at all sure that he would win. He even had a plan in case he lost. 2 autos waited outside the Polo Grounds, one that would allow him to make a very public exit if he won, and another that would whisk him away in stealth if he lost. Also, In the weeks leading up to the fight, he had become obsessed with disguises and had employed the services of several makeup artists to create fake beards and moustaches. Floyd had them at the ready in his Polo Grounds dressing room. If he lost, he planned to disguise himself so he could flee the stadium unrecognised. But there would be no need for this on this occasion. Instead, the night was for celebrating. Floyd was now the first man ever to win the heavyweight championship for a second time. The next morning, the new champ arrived at the post-fight press conference, beaming and feeling confident enough to take verbal jabs at the boxing writers who had predicted his annihilation at the hands of Johansson. Later, he rode in a parade in Brooklyn that snaked its way from Grand Army Plaza to Borough Hall, with the borough president, John Cashmore, seated beside him. A few days after the fight, New York City Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. declared World Championship Day for the city, and on the steps of City Hall presented Floyd with an award. A 2-hour parade took place in Harlem, where Patterson basked in the sort of adoration the African-American community had early bestowed on Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson. Jackie Robinson and Ed Sullivan co-chaired a testimonial dinner for Patterson at the Commodore Hotel, with the proceeds going to the Wiltwick School for Boys. Dinner guests ranged from government figures such as Mayor Wagner and Justice Justine Wise Polier to sports luminaires like retired Dodgers and Cardinals general manager Branch Rickey, the man who had integrated Major League Baseball by signing Jackie Robinson. Pope John the 25th sent a congratulatory telegram. The President of Ghana sent a ceremonial robe. Patterson also delivered a speech to a graduating class at his alma mater. "I'm proud to bring back the championship to America and to PS 614, he said. A huge photograph of himself hanging behind him as he said it. But there was more. For the first time, Patterson began to admit that race was elemental in the contest. He told Ebony magazine that he believed he regained the championship for himself, his country, and his race. He said, "Joe Louis did a lot for Negroes. He did more for our race than almost anybody. Every person, every Negro in boxing is trying to get somewhere near the record set by Louis." That Louis backed Floyd in this contest stoked Patterson's sense of racial pride. "It was a victory for us," proclaimed the Ebony editors. Finally, Floyd's victory was celebrated in verse by a self-styled poet, then little known outside the world of amateur boxing. Like bards of old, he carried his poems in his head, ready to recite at the appropriate occasion. Rather than write them down, this particular poem he delivered while performing sit-ups at the New Yorker's A.J. Liebelin scribbled the lines, "You may talk about the Swede, you may talk about Rome, but Rockville Centre is Floyd Patterson's home. A lot of people say Floyd couldn't fight, but you should have seen him on that comeback night. He cut up his eyes, he messed up his face, and that last left hook knocked his head out of place. If he would have stayed in Sweden, he wouldn't have taken that beating." Well, that particular poet's name turned out to be a certain Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. For now, Floyd was back on top of the world, and he lost little time making a deal to give Johansson a rematch. After a contorted process to work out the details, the rubber match in their series was set for March 13, 1961 in Miami. Before Floyd began training in earnest, he took time off to travel to Rome, where the American team was competing in the 1960 Olympics. There, he ran into Cassius Clay, who had dazzled Olympic spectators with his boxing skills while winning the light heavyweight gold medal. Clay was as proud of his Olympic win as Patterson had been of his own 8 years earlier, maybe even more so. Clay had not taken off his medal since he received it on the victor's platform, wearing it even while sleeping. While being interviewed by Earl Ruby of his hometown newspaper, the Louisville Courier-Journal, Clay spotted Patterson and said, "Good Lord, there's the champ." Clay ran over to greet the recrowned heavyweight king. Patterson was Clay's hero. It was Patterson who had showed it was possible for a heavyweight to possess a middleweight's hand speed and fluidity in the ring, and Clay was building his own career around those qualities. After Clay saw Patterson's fight with Brian London on TV, he became obsessed with winning the heavyweight championship someday. At one point, Clay had travelled to Indianapolis with his father and brother Rudolph Valentino Clay to seek out D'Amato, who was in the city with Patterson for an exhibition. Clay's father inquired whether D'Amato might consider managing his son Cassius, who was already showing a lot of promise as an amateur. D'Amato passed, but Clay did get to meet Patterson briefly. Now in Rome, Patterson recognised the hyper-animated 18-year-old boxer with the medal around his neck and the non-stop mouth. "Hi boy, how's your dad?" Patterson said. For the benefit of the reporters who had ambled up to the scene, Clay, who stood 6 feet 3 inches, said, "Look, I'm 3 inches taller than him. When I fill out, I'll be bigger all around. That's something good to know. You see, I might have to fight him someday." That same day, Clay stood in the Quonset hut that served as the dining hall, carrying on with a group of African-American boxers and track athletes. Clay spied Patterson strolling through the building and said, "Watch this. I'm going to get this guy. Watch this." As soon as Patterson reached Clay and the others, Clay jumped up on the table with a knife and fork and proclaimed to the heavyweight champion, "I'm having you next. I'm having you for dinner." Patterson laughed. From the beginning, he understood Clay's shtick in a way some later fighters never could. While in Rome, Floyd took part in another meeting of significance, but this one included no levity whatsoever. Pope John the 23rd had granted him an audience. It was an important moment in his life as a Catholic, and Floyd was nervous, fearful of making a mistake. As sweat trickling down his face, he kneeled and he kissed the pontiff's ring. The audience was a success. Floyd left the Vatican, relieved that he had not messed up. Promoters wanted Johansson to train for a while in Miami to boost the ticket sales, and made arrangements for him to work out at the 5th Street Gym, which was run by Cus Dundee, a Philadelphia-born promoter with deep ties to big-time boxing. Publicist Harold Conrad arrived at the gym with Johansson and Whitey Bimstein in tow. Only after arriving did they realise that they had failed to line up sparring partners for Johansson. So Conrad asked Dundee's brother trainer, Angelo Dundee, if he had anyone the ex-champ could work with. Angelo called to a young boxer, who turned out to be none other than Cassius Clay. Clay had wasted no time in turning pro after the Olympic triumph. The syndicate of Louisville businessmen who managed Clay had hired Dundee as his trainer, who then moved Clay to Miami so he could train at his brother's gym. Clay's performance against Johansson left Conrad and Bimstein flabbergasted. Johansson looked helpless against the fast young man who never stopped talking. Johansson was furious, Conrad said. I mean, he was pissed. He started chasing Clay around the ring, throwing right hands and missing by 20 feet, looking ludicrous. All the while, Clay kept chanting that he was the one who should be fighting Patterson for the championship, not Johansson. After just 2 rounds with Clay, the gasping Johansson was unable to continue. Gil Rogan, then a young writer for Sports Illustrated, having witnessed the scene, told sceptical editors back in New York that he was confident Clay was a future heavyweight champion of the world. Without question, Clay was sharp at Miami's 5th Street Gym that day, but it was easy for him to look good against Johansson, who, despondent after his loss to Patterson, had let himself fall out of shape. Ingo was 12 pounds over his prime fighting weight. All 12 of those pounds seemed to be nothing but flab. For the sake of his own reputation, Floyd hoped for an impressive win over Johansson, something that would prove that what had happened at the Polo Grounds was no fluke. Boxing protagonist agreed that Patterson was likely to get just that against an ill-prepared opponent. A couple of weeks before the fight, Robert H. Boyle of Sports Illustrated reported on the Discord in the Patterson camp. He described Floyd's extended group of associates as being the most bizarre cast of characters to hit the road since Jack Kerouac and buddies careered across the country. The article focused on Julius November, Roy Cohn, Bill Fugazi, Irving Kahn, and especially Cus D'Amato. The sole tragic figure in the lot, he said, is Cus D'Amato, entangled in all sorts of legal snares. The press often reviles him as a crook. A crook he is not. A kook he may be. Boyle exposed the diminished role D'Amato had in all matters pertaining to Floyd Patterson. He said, most of the time, I just lie around. I read, I play with the dog, anything to avoid boredom. Boyle reported that with D'Amato all but out of the picture, the management power had shifted to November, whom Boyle described as a big, bald, baby-faced Brooklynite, a boastful man who liked to tell people about the honours he won in law school. Fugazi confirmed to Boyle what a lot of outside observers had decided. Cus D'Amato was all but completely out of the Patterson picture. He is not calling the shots, Fugazi said. The article seemed to be a truthful assessment of the situation, with the people controlling the promotion of Patterson's fights speaking honestly, if somewhat harshly. But November did not take it that way. He actually sued Sports Illustrated for libel, saying the article defamed him as an attorney and a man. The suit never actually went to trial, so presumably it was settled out of court. Patterson's followers were about to learn that the tumult wasn't limited to Patterson's professional associates. It was affecting the champ as well. A week later, the New York Times magazine ran one of the most in-depth profiles of Patterson that was published. Not surprisingly, its author was Gay Talese. Patterson opened up to Talese more than he ever did to any other writer about his shyness and insecurity had left him petrified as a child, unable to hold his head up, and how those things still affected him in life. "I'm a lot better now," Patterson told Talese, "but I remember the funny feeling I had in Rome last year as I waited for my audience with the Pope." Floyd recounted how he'd sweated in the presence of John the 23rd. Readers also learnt about Patterson's growing affection for Sweden. After his loss to Johansson, Floyd received hundreds of letters from Swedish fans saying they were sorry he'd lost. Not so many encouraging letters came from people in this country. To repay the kindness, Patterson visited Sweden following the second Johansson fight, where he was received with adoration. The nation impressed him. "Everywhere I went in Sweden, I saw there was no colour line," he said. Mixed-race couples were able to walk down the street without fear. Floyd told Talese that while he was enjoying the racial equality overseas, his wife was having trouble getting an appointment back home at a Rockville Centre beauty salon. When Julius November's wife, who was white, experienced no difficulty at the same salon, it was all too apparent that Sandra was a victim of prejudice. "I wanted to make this incident known," Patterson told Talese. "I didn't want coloured people to go there and receive the embarrassment my wife received." Then Patterson learned that the shop was operated by a Swedish family. He couldn't believe it, but Sandra double-checked, and yes, it was true. "And I didn't know what to say," Patterson said. The heavyweight champion divulged that he struggled with racism every day. Patterson shared with Talese that he'd been thinking about moving his family to the upscale suburb of Scarsdale, but had been warned that it would be unwise for him to do so because black people weren't welcome there. As for the fight in Miami, a city that in early 1961 was primarily Southern in its attitudes, Patterson said he would take part in the Johansson rematch there only if he could be guaranteed that seating would be totally desegregated, holding true to a promise he'd made to himself when he fought the exhibition match in Fort Smith. The promoters agreed to Patterson's stipulation, certainly the first time such a demand from an African-American athlete had ever been granted in the South. He said, "I used to think Jesus was a white man. All the pictures I've ever seen of him showed him white, but I can no longer accept him as a white man. He either is a Jesus of no colour or a Jesus with skin that is all colours." It was a bold thing to declare in America in 1961. Patterson told Talese he'd learnt a lot from Johansson during the year Ingo was champion. He'd hear Johansson saying things at press conferences, mostly dismissive statements about his opponents, that Floyd thought one wasn't supposed to say. Patterson decided to speak his mind more readily. He wouldn't resort to insulting other boxers. He would, however, speak out in his subtle way about matters of racial injustice and fair play. Long gone were the days when Floyd would depend on Cus D'Amato to do all the talking. If Floyd had practised self-denial at his training camps and in his choice of accommodations at earlier fights, a freezing jockey's room, a rat-infested abandoned dance hall, he now indulged himself. He lodged at a villa in an upscale Miami neighbourhood. Apart from his wife and his daughters and his recently born son, Floyd Jr., he trained at Miami Beach's Hotel de Val, a fabulous Mimo structure that was one of Sinatra's favourite hangouts. At the villa, he greeted the New Yorker's A.J. Liebling while wearing a silk dressing robe. To Liebling's eye, it appeared Patterson had flashed out to a full heavyweight with ropey muscle showing around the base of his neck. But the champ exuded anything but confidence. Patterson said a bad dream was haunting him, so bad he couldn't describe it. He said, "It's lucky I'm not superstitious. If I was, I wouldn't go through with this fight." Liebling could hardly believe his ears. Neither fighter seemed particularly hungry for the title. Cus D'Amato, arriving in Miami with his position in the Patterson entourage reduced to little more than that of a hanger-on, considered the fight to be a no-win situation for Floyd. D'Amato thought Johansson would be as good as ever in the ring, gluttony aside. Floyd would have to fight his best fight to win, but D'Amato thought the boxing press would refuse to recognise the situation as such. If Patterson won, D'Amato believed the press would report it was because Johansson was fat and out of shape. If Johansson won, well, then that would prove that Patterson was really a bum all along, a bum who lost to another bum who wasn't even in condition. No doubt the fighters themselves held similar concerns. For the average boxing fan, the bout promised to be a ho-hum affair. Early on, ticket sales were as soft as Johansson's expanding gut, only picking up once promoters resorted to fire sale pricing. $100 ringside seats could be had for as little as $20. Matters were better organised than they had been at the Polo Grounds. There were no riots this time. This time, since the bout was taking place in Miami instead of New York State, where he remained banned as a manager, advisor, Cus D'Amato was among those working Patterson's crowded corner. The others were Dan and Nick Florio and Buster Watson. Liebling, watching from ringside, wasn't sure having D'Amato as a second was such a good idea. He feared D'Amato's presence made Patterson jumpy. He said, "It must be like having your old man in your corner." Patterson certainly seemed jumpy during the hours before the opening bell. Perhaps he was still haunted by the indescribable nightmare. He remained on edge when he climbed through the ropes for the fight's first round. He had good reason to be anxious. The jab Patterson had been trying to improve in recent weeks was ineffective as the fight got underway. After throwing one, Floyd committed the cardinal sin of failing to follow it with another jab or a right cross. He also failed to step out of Johansson's range. Ingo may have been soft and already breathing hard, but he reacted to the amateurish opening. Patterson provided him. Johnson's thunder flew, and Floyd, a 4-1 favourite, collapsed. The crowd gasped. Patterson shook off the blow and was back on his feet just after 2 seconds. The referee, a local fireman, signalled for the boxers to resume fighting. Just a few seconds later, Patterson went down again. For the moment, it seemed as if the bloated Johansson was somehow going to pull it off again. Floor Patterson over and over until Floyd could no longer fight. But then Patterson surprised Johansson with a left hook that floored the ex-champ. Like Patterson, Johansson refused to stay down. The bell rang to end the round, and the audience applauded crazily, certain an out-and-out Donnybrook was in the works. In the second round, the fight quickly became boring. Patterson boxed carelessly, leaving himself vulnerable to attack, but Johansson, his energy already spent, couldn't exploit the openings that Floyd had offered him. All Ingo seemed to be able to do was trudge ponderously after Floyd. It went on like this for 4 rounds. The audience growing ever more discontented by the lack of action. When they came out for the 6th, said Liebling, Johansson made his last charge, and Patterson backed away, as if to gauge the force left in the harpooning dying Papoise. Patterson hit him with a left hook to the body, followed by 2 rights. The fireman ended the fight at 2 minutes and 45 seconds of the round, declaring Johansson knocked out, as the fans booed referee and boxers alike. Patterson paid them no heed, but he did do something that no one could ever remember seeing in a boxing ring before. He kissed Johansson on the cheek after his defeated opponent stood back up. Floyd said later, "I think I called it girlish when they asked me about it, but it was my expression of admiration for a man who had fought me well." The fight reviews were anything but expressions of admiration. Even sympathetic writers like Liebling determined that Patterson was a second-rate heavyweight champion. For Howard Cosell, the second Johansson fight had been the zenith of Floyd Patterson's career. He believed the third meeting was the beginning of some sort of decline. Floyd was just too vulnerable to right hands. Even harsher criticism came from Jimmy Cannon, who ridiculed Patterson at length for his inability to take a punch and remain on his feet. He said, "At first I thought he would be the first heavyweight champion with a cauliflower tail, but he is still able to sit in hard-seated chairs during television interviews without squirming. The champion has become a master of the pratfall. Only Red Skeleton challenges him in this line." Cannon listed Patterson as no better than the 10th best of 11 heavyweight champions since Max Schmeling won the title in 1930, rating even mediocre champions like Primo Carnera and Jack Sharkey above him. The only solace Patterson could take from Cannon's heavy-handed column was that Johansson was ranked 11th. Yet, with the public beyond the boxing ring, Patterson stood at the peak of his popularity. He may not have sung duets with Dinah Shore on TV, but he had learned from Johansson how he could make the most of his heavyweight crown in terms of generating publicity, and he planned to use it for causes he valued. A little more than a month after the fight, NAACP Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins introduced Floyd as the chair of a membership and fundraising drive for the civil rights organisation's New York City operations. The goal was to raise $1 million for legal and educational programmes while boosting membership from 27,000 to 50,000. Co-chairing the effort with Floyd was Jackie Robinson. In addition to the NAACP project, Patterson raised money to create a halfway house for Wiltwick boys transitioning from the school to life back in the city. He put up $12,500 of his own money and secured pledges for an additional $12,500 to help establish what would become known as the Floyd Patterson House. There was also opportunity for Floyd to make some money for himself. A deal was struck with Bernard Geiss Associates to publish Floyd's autobiography. Bernard Geiss, described by sports writer and broadcasting legend Dick Schaap as a large-sized middle-aged cherub who can quote sales figures and Shakespearean sonnets with equal ease, issued only 10 or 12 titles a year, cutting deals with major publishers to distribute books for him. Because Geiss published so little, he aimed for bestseller status for each of his titles. He is a home run swinger in a league of bunters, Schaap said. Geiss published sensational, racy runaway hits like The Valley of the Dolls and Sex and the Single Girl. Patterson's life story was in no way a salacious matter, so it was hard to imagine it as a home run along the lines of Valley of the Dolls. But Geiss moved ahead with the project, which Patterson insisted be told in a dignified way, though Geiss's books typically weren't well written. Patterson lacked the writing skills to pen the book without assistance. Finding the perfect collaborator proved to be a tricky task. The first ghostwriter to audition, whose identity has been lost, failed to produce a manuscript acceptable to anyone involved. Next came Arthur Mann, an author who wrote for newspapers and magazines. He had also worked under Branch Rickey as a publicist for the Dodgers and the Pirates. Mann's manuscript pleased Geiss, who enthusiastically sent it to Patterson along with a letter of congratulations. It wound up at Julius November's office for review. A November associate, Joel Weinberg, shared experts with Floyd, who didn't like Mann's heroic portrayal of D'Amato. Floyd told Weinberg it should be retitled Cus D'Amato's War Against the IBC. November ordered that Mann be fired from the project. The third and final ghostwriter was Milton Gross, who proved to be the perfect match for Patterson. At the time, Gross was a significant figure in the American sports writing world. The New York Post boasted the best sports section in New York, and Gross became its star in the late 1950s and early 1960s when he replaced Jimmy Cannon to write the 5-day-a-week column, which was syndicated to scores of other newspapers. Gross was one of the first sports writers to probe the troubled souls of athletes. One of his most famous and most influential columns was The Long Ride Home, about Dodger pitcher Don Newcombe, who lost the deciding game of the 1956 World Series. Gross also was among the first journalists to tackle the issues of race as they pertained to big-time sports. Gross sensed that he was onto something big with the Patterson autobiography, and he certainly worked hard at it. He went through his personal files and found he'd written more than 100 columns and articles about Patterson already, which he organised for use in the text. Then he taped interviews with Patterson, some 30 hours of them, after which he went to work writing. Patterson then worked closely with Gross during the composition stage of the project and took his part in it seriously, sometimes referring to the big dictionary that was always at hand when reading or writing. "Once I used that instead of which, and he corrected me," Gross said, "and he's very conscious of me and I." Fundraising and writing a book took time and energy, which might have been fine if Floyd were content with what he had accomplished as a boxer. but he wanted to continue to fight. Looming were heavyweight challengers who were much more dangerous than any he had faced so far. Patterson would have to fight better than ever if he wanted to retain his heavyweight crown. November 8, 1960 was a day of celebration for Floyd Patterson, as it was for many African Americans. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected President of the United States. Kennedy was young, still in his 40s, and for Patterson and other black Americans, Kennedy's ascendancy to the White House promised a break with past practices, especially in terms of race relations. It was the dawn of a new era in America, and Floyd was a product of the brand of liberalism that Kennedy embraced. Poor and otherwise disadvantaged as a child, Floyd had undergone a life-changing experience at Wilwick, the very sort of social experiment that true believers in progressive policies could point to as a success. As an adult, Floyd was like Kennedy, well-mannered, well-dressed and well-spoken, always conscious of his public image. Floyd was willing to speak out against social ills, and he did so in a forthright yet polished manner, never allowing his emotions to take charge. Many Kennedy supporters, even those with no interest in sports, were Patterson fans. As Kennedy took office in January 1961, Floyd stood as something of a symbol of the new frontier, a living, breathing answer to the problems of ignorance and prejudice, poverty and surplus that Kennedy had addressed during the campaign. Floyd would carry more than just himself into the boxing ring as he continued to defend his title. 3 contenders seemed to be the obvious choices as Patterson positioned himself for his next contest. California's Eddie Machen and 2 Texas-born fighters, Cleveland Big Cat Williams and Zora Foley. All 3 boxers had good records of quality wins mixed with the occasional embarrassing loss. Machen was a puzzle, both in and out of the ring, but when he was emotionally sound, he could fight very well. Williams was a power hitter who'd racked up an impressive number of knockouts. Foley possessed the best boxing skills and ring savvy of the 3. Cus D'Amato had been scolded by the boxing press for not lining up these fighters earlier in Patterson's career. Now that Floyd was in charge, he could have assuaged the criticism and signed to fight one of them. Or he could have gone a step further and signed the man nearly everyone now conceded as the best of the heavyweight contenders, a fierce fighter who seemed to bring the force of a tsunami into the ring with him. His name was Charles Sonny Liston, a convicted felon with a reputation for beating anyone who stood in his way, in or out of the ring, cops included. In the previous year, he had scored impressive knockouts against Williams and Foley and won a unanimous decision over Machen. Liston had also dispatched Roy Harris in just 1 round. Patterson? Well, he ended up choosing Tom McNeely. McNeely hardly seemed a worthy opponent for the world heavyweight champion. Tom McNeely was a tall, thin, Boston-based fighter who sounded something like Rocky Marciano when he spoke, but possessed very few of The Rock's boxing skills. He was athletic enough to have played football under Duffy Doherty at Michigan State, and since leaving college had defeated 23 prize fighters. But he was not a true contender for the heavyweight championship. Even Boston newspaper writers dismissed their hometown boy as nothing more than an embarrassingly inept ring mauler. Fighting McNeely seemed like a surefire win for Floyd, an easy payday against yet another white boxer. The original intention was for Patterson and McNeely to clash at the fabled Boston Garden. Although Cus D'Amato had been relegated to the status of advisor, he nonetheless wound up deeply involved in making decisions about the fight's details. D'Amato insisted on a non-resident referee clause in the contract, fearing that a Massachusetts ref would favour McNeely. The Massachusetts State Boxing Commission refused to accept that condition. D'Amato dug in his feet over the matter. With neither side budging, promoters began looking for another host city. In early October 1961, they announced that the fight would occur in Toronto on December 4, 1961, 9 months after the Patterson-Johansson third bout. Ex-champ Jersey Joe Walcott would be the referee. A sellout at the Maple Leaf Gardens was expected to garner around $300,000, with Patterson guaranteed to get 40% of the gate. More importantly, he would receive half the money teleprompter paid for the closed-circuit TV rights. Cautious Cus demanded that McNeely's manager Boston blue-blooded sportsman Peter Davenport Fuller put up $1 million in escrow to serve as a guarantee for a return bout in the event Patterson lost. If Patterson lost and Fuller failed to arrange the rematch, Fuller would lose the $1 million. Once that was agreed upon, the contracts were signed. The odds makers expressed solid confidence in Patterson. He was a 10-1 favourite. The other star of the closed-circuit broadcast was Sonny Liston, fighting German Albert Westphal in Philadelphia immediately prior to Floyd's fight. The pairing of Patterson and Liston's fights on the same broadcast was tantalising to fight fans, since Liston was now the number one threat to Floyd. Viewers would have the chance to compare the fighters' performances and speculate what a battle between the two might be like if such a contest could ever be lined up. Like Patterson, Liston was a 10-1 favourite against Westphal, even though Westphal was a better boxer than McNeely. Despite the odds, bettors found both fights boring prospects and stayed away from the bookmakers. Ticket sales were dismal too, enough so that promoters allowed only 16 locations in the Toronto metropolitan area to carry the closed-circuit broadcast. Earlier, the area had been blacked out. Those closed-circuit viewers watched Liston demolish Westphal in the first round of their Philadelphia fight, with a few jabs followed by a massive 1-2 combination. Westphal stayed down for well past the count of 10. Liston wasn't in the ring long enough to start breathing hard. Patterson's victory in Toronto was just as one-sided, although McNeely's agony at the Maple Leaf Gardens lasted 4 times as long as Westphal's. This time, it was the challenger, not the champ, who hit the canvas over and over, so many times in fact that there is dispute over just how many knockdowns there actually were. It took 10 minutes before McNeely was able to exit the ring after Floyd knocked him out in the 4th round. Another half hour passed before his trainers allowed anyone except family members into his dressing room. When the press finally managed to interview him, McNeely said, "If anybody tells you Patterson can't hit, you tell them to come see me. He's the fastest puncher I've ever faced and one of the hardest punchers." No one cared much about the assessment of a nobody like McNeely. Boxing fan President Kennedy, who watched on a closed-circuit feed of the White House, said he thought the fight night fans would have been better served if Patterson and Liston had fought each other, although he would soon take a different view of the matter. It seemed logical that Kennedy and Patterson should meet, given their common stance on civil rights and Kennedy's love of sports. Influential newspaper columnist Drew Pearson set about to arrange such a meeting in early 1962. Patterson wrote to Kenneth O'Donnell, who was part of the so-called Irish mafia of White House officials who had Kennedy's ear, and urged O'Donnell to set up a photo opportunity and brief conversation between the champ and the president centred around Big Brothers of America, a charity Patterson supported. On January the 12th, a month after the McNeely fight, the White House gave Pearson and Patterson 10 minutes between the President's Oval Office meetings with the ambassador to Ireland and the ambassador to the Republic of China. At 12:25 p.m, Patterson shook hands with President Kennedy. The champ and the President posed for photos with Pearson, District of Columbia Commissioner John Duncan, and a 10-year-old little brother, Freddie Cicala. At one point, Kennedy grasped Patterson's arm and said he was impressed by the shape Patterson was in. For his part, Patterson found Kennedy's knowledge of boxing to be a pleasant revelation. During their conversation, Kennedy asked Patterson who his next challenger would be. Patterson replied that he had Sonny Liston in his sights. Kennedy suggested that Floyd avoid Liston, citing Justice Department concerns about Liston's ties to organised crime. But Floyd was resolute. Liston was the man, even though he was not ready to make that official. Not just yet. After the meeting, Patterson told members of the press that he had confided to the president whom he would fight next. When pressed for a name, Patterson nodded towards the president's office and suggested that reporters ask Kennedy. When Kennedy was asked about it at a subsequent press conference, he referred reporters to Patterson. When a reporter mentioned Liston, Floyd suggested 2 other possible contenders, Zora Foley and Roy Harris. That night, Patterson was feted at a banquet where Attorney General Robert Kennedy also asked Patterson not to fight Liston. Robert Kennedy had positioned himself as a crusader against organised crime, and Liston's alleged mob connections must have made him especially unsuitable as a potential heavyweight champion. But Patterson was firm with Bobby Kennedy as well. After his meetings with the Kennedy brothers, Patterson left Washington, his spirits soaring. He wrote to the younger Kennedy that the Oval Office visit made for the most memorable day of my life. Most important than anything he'd accomplished in the ring, he said. A little more than a week later, Floyd attended opening ceremonies for the Floyd Patterson House, 208 to 210 East 18th Street in New York. The halfway house for Wiltwyck boys entering New York City public schools and life on city streets had become a project close to Floyd's heart. He devoted both money and time to it. At times he provided tickets for his New York fights to house residents. He also bought special guests by to meet the boys, some of them celebrities like movie director John Huston. The house helped many boys make a successful transition. For others, the outcome was less positive. Some of the boys were violent still and maladjusted, even after the time at Wiltwyck, and counsellors could be overwhelmed by the extent of the problems they faced. Drugs sometimes made their way into the facility, but while there were failings, there was also victories. While at the opening ceremonies, Patterson discussed his next fight with reporters. This time he was less coy. Yes, Liston would likely be the challenger, he said, but the deal wasn't set. In 1961, the New York State Athletic Commission had announced it would not grant Liston a boxing licence, citing his multiple police arrest and prison terms. The NAACP and other prominent organisations and individuals agreed with the Commission's decision. Less-known well groups weighed in as well, such as the Susquehanna Valley Lodge, number 52 of the Fraternal Order of Police. They said, "We strongly object to Mr. Liston getting an opportunity to influence young people toward a way of life which is not only unchristian but diametrically opposed to all that is good in America." Floyd understood that he would be perceived as a much more appealing champ than someone like Liston, but he also believed that Liston deserved to be a licensed fighter. In Patterson's opinion, Liston had paid his debt to society, and fair play demanded that Sonny be allowed to compete like everyone else. He said, "One night in bed, I made up my mind. I knew if I wanted to sleep comfortably, I'd have to take on Liston, even though the NAACP and the Kiefer Committee didn't want me to take on the fight. Some people said, what if you lose and he wins? Then the coloured people will suffer. But maybe if Liston wins, he'll live up to that title. He may make people look up to him." By St. Patrick's Day, 1962, Floyd Patterson and Julius November had made it official. Sonny Liston was to be the next opponent. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That comes to the end of part 3 of Floyd Patterson's career profile. A much longer episode than the first 2 parts, and you can appreciate why that is. We've done a lot on Johansson and Patterson for this particular episode, and some of the stuff that was going on outside of the ring, the depression he went into after his first fight with Patterson, and of course now leading into part 4, the final part of his career profile, where we go into the fights with Sonny Liston. Very, very excited to get that episode delivered to you guys. And I appreciate, again, all the feedback that's been provided so far for the episodes and for the show in general. So please continue to do it if you've enjoyed this part of Floyd Patterson's career profile and the tale so far. Please do let me know. If you haven't already commented on Spotify, please do leave a comment. It is really appreciated. It allows me to continue to structure the shows going forward, knowing that you guys prefer things in a certain way. I know this has been a bit longer, but I didn't want to scrimp and scrape on any of the details on his career. So I decided this one would be a little bit longer than the last 2, and then we'll move into the last episode, part 4 of his career profile, and we'll round that off very nicely with a very good telling of what Floyd's career was all about, and life, of course, after boxing. So if you haven't already followed us on social media, if you're on X, you can find us at career_profiles. If you're on any other platform, it's at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Thank you so much again, as always, for listening to the show. Thank you so much for everybody that's been jumping into the live videos I've been doing and saying about the episodes. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much also for that. If you've not subscribed to us on the podcast platforms, please make sure you do so. We are mainly on Apple, mainly on Spotify, but you can find us on any other available podcasting app out there. They're the big two for us, so please make sure if you haven't already subscribed to us, do so. If you are subscribed to us already on Spotify, leave your comments, leave your ratings. If you're on Apple, leave your ratings, leave your reviews. All of it really, really does help. I hope you guys listening on Patreon have enjoyed early access to the episodes so far. Thank you so much for bearing with us while we had a little hiatus. We hope you've enjoyed having that as a benefit of being a patron. And if you're not a patron and you do want early access to episodes like this, ad-free episodes, you want all the videos up there, you want all the additional content that hasn't been released to the general public, you can check us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, The Career of Floyd Patterson, Part 3. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.